In the dim hush of her Montmartre studio, Suzanne Valadon stood alone beside a torn canvas, its colors still trembling with the heat of a vanished secret. A shattered glass glimmered on the floor, catching the faint morning light. Neighbors whispered that the painting she destroyed revealed a truth she feared to let live that fateful winter night in silence. Welcome, dear listener. Tell me where and when you join this wandering tale, adding your place to our shared memory. Please subscribe so these forgotten lives may continue their return. The wind of Montmartre rises again, stirring the sketch that lay abandoned on the cobblestones, its edges curled like the petals of a withering flower. It is from this fragile scrap, drifting at the foot of the hill as if seeking a hand to lift it, that our remembrance begins. For the streets of Paris hold memories the way old trees hold rings, quietly tightening around the lives that once passed beneath them. In those early years, before Suzanne Valadon's name carried any weight, she was simply a faint figure glimpsed along these slopes, a girl moving with a swiftness that suggested hunger, purpose, or perhaps the need to stay ahead of her own thoughts. The air around her seemed always charged, as though the city itself recognized the restless force that would one day push her from obscurity into the tumult of fame. But here, in the hush that follows dawn, she appears only as a shadow woven into the waking streets. Many stories of great artists begin with triumph, but Suzanne's story begins with the sensation of being overlooked. Those who crossed paths with her in the earliest chapter of her life would have noticed the firm line of her jaw, the suspicion in her gaze, the way she stepped around patches of mud without losing speed, as though she had long ago decided that nothing would hold her. Yet even in her determination, there remained the slight bend of someone accustomed to uncertainty. Perhaps this is why I find myself drawn to that face in the morning haze, the face of one who stands at the edge of her own becoming, without any witness to mark the moment. Crafting such a beginning invites us to lean closer, to listen more carefully, for quiet origins often hide the most powerful storms. As the market stalls rattled open and the bakers carried trays of warm bread into the street, Suzanne would have walked among them unnoticed, her figure merging with the swirl of shopkeepers, stray cats, and pale sunlight. There is something stirring in the image of a future painter, not yet aware that she will carve her name into the history of modern art, drifting with the anonymity of a leaf caught in the city's breath. Does the world sense the arrival of a rebel before she first defies it? Or does transformation happen in secret, like the slow cracking of stone beneath water? These questions follow her like faint echoes even now, for the path she walked would lead not only to recognition, but also to scandal, heartbreak, and the fierce independence that would one day define her. Montmartre itself was a place of contradictions. It was beautiful yet shabby, a hill where artists and beggars lived side by side, where songs mixed with quarrels and drunken laughter spilled from the doorways of small cafes. It was a home for dreamers and for those who had been abandoned by their dreams. Perhaps this duality shaped Suzanne more than any single event. Growing up among these twisting streets, she learned early that life offered little mercy to those who waited for permission. The world belonged to the ones who claimed their place, whether by charm, by cunning, or by sheer refusal to be erased. It is no surprise, then, that she developed a gaze sharp enough to cut through the pretense around her. That gaze would one day unsettle critics who found her work too raw, too honest, too unwilling to flatter the viewer's expectations. Yet in these earliest reflections, before her name ever circulated among painters' conversations, she was simply a child of Montmartre's pulse. We must imagine her pausing at the steps leading toward the summit, watching the slow trickle of strangers climbing toward the basilica. She might have felt the rumble of distant carriages or heard the melody of a violin drifting from a cafe terrace. The city's sounds surrounded her like a low hymn, offering hints of the life she had not yet lived. And still, there was something unsettled within her, a quiet awareness that she did not belong solely to this world of noise and poverty. She was drawn to movement, to risk, to the daring occupations that would place her body and spirit in danger. This hunger for something beyond the ordinary would eventually sweep her into circles where artists captured her image again and again, fascinated by the very restlessness she carried. But before any canvas bore her likeness, before any critic whispered her name with either admiration or disdain, Suzanne was a girl caught in the soft grip of possibility. The mornings of her youth were filled with small observations, the way sunlight struck a puddle, the curve of a neighbor's hand as he folded a cloth, the crooked tilt of a rooftop chimney. Perhaps she felt these impressions accumulating inside her without knowing that each detail would one day guide her hand as she reached for a paintbrush. These early moments remind us that the seeds of an artist's life are often planted long before the artist has a name. They settle quietly in the soil of experience and wait for the right season to rise. As we stand at this threshold of her story, we must move slowly, for the path ahead does not rush toward glory. It winds through hardship and hunger, through friendships formed out of necessity and broken by disappointment, through the thick fog of society's judgments. Suzanne's future will carry her into studios where she will pose for men whose paintings become world-renowned, even as her own talent remains hidden in the margins. She will taste success and disaster in equal measure, and the colors she lays on canvas will reflect the conflicts she carries within. Yet for now, she is only a silhouette on a street washed in pale light, bending to retrieve the lost sketch that dances at her feet. The wind lifts again, sweeping dust across the stones. The paper shivers, its faint charcoal lines revealing nothing at first glance, and yet holding everything of what is to come. Perhaps Suzanne studies it with a puzzled expression, wondering who drew it or why it speaks to her in a way she cannot name. Or perhaps she tucks it away without thought, the gesture of someone accustomed to collecting fragments of beauty wherever she finds them. Whatever her reasons, the sketch becomes the first small mystery of her unfolding journey, a whisper of the life she has not yet claimed, a life waiting just beyond the crest of Montmartre. And as she walks away, the final corner of the page flutters like a reluctant farewell, leaving us with the image of a girl stepping into the uncertain morning, not yet aware that she walks toward the tumult that will shape her destiny. The paper she carried crinkled softly in her hand as she climbed the narrow street, its charcoal lines rubbing faintly against her palm with each step, as if urging her to look again, to recognize something hidden in its strokes. But Suzanne Valadon did not pause. She walked with the steady rhythm of someone who had learned long ago that stopping invited questions she did not wish to answer. Her childhood had taught her that movement was safety, and safety was a privilege not easily granted. The origins of her story do not lie in a peaceful cradle or a warm home where family gathered around a glowing hearth. Instead, they are found in the unsettled corners of a traveling life, in rooms that were temporary, and in the sounds of a mother's weary footsteps echoing from one uncertain job to the next. Born in 1865 in the small town of Bassines, she arrived in the world without the comfort of stability. Her mother, Madeleine, worked as a laundress and housemaid, jobs that consumed her strength and rarely rewarded it. There was no father to soften the hardships, no inheritance of comfort waiting in the shadows. Suzanne, known then as Marie Clémentine, entered a life where each day was shaped by the need to endure. From the beginning, she carried within her the fierce resilience of a child who understood that she must rely upon herself. When her mother brought her to Paris in search of work, the city greeted them not with promise but with indifference. They lived among the humbler quarters where narrow staircases led to cramped rooms shared by children, laborers, widows, and anyone else who had been pushed to the margins of the growing metropolis. Yet in these strange surroundings, Suzanne discovered the first sparks of what would become her defining force, an unwillingness to bow to circumstance. As a girl, she earned coins doing odd tasks, helping vendors, carrying parcels, or running small errands for anyone who would trust her with them. She watched people carefully, memorizing gestures, tones, and expressions. Sometimes she would trace these details in her mind later, as if attempting to capture something she sensed but did not yet understand. Her early motivations were shaped not by dreams of fame, but by something more urgent: survival. She learned quickly that poverty made one invisible unless one learned to insist on being seen. This determination pushed her toward bold decisions, including her brief attempt to join the world of circus performers. She had trained herself to balance, to climb, to leap, hoping that the freedom of the acrobat might free her from the weight pressing constantly on her young shoulders. For a time, she imagined herself soaring in front of crowds, her body defying gravity, her spirit unbound. But fate intervened one afternoon when a fall during rehearsal ended her ambitions. Her body ached bitterly for weeks, her pride far longer. Yet even in this disappointment, she did not break. She simply turned her gaze back toward Paris, that restless city that both nurtured and neglected its children. It was during this period of searching that she drifted into Montmartre, the hill that towered over the city like a guardian of renegades and dreamers. Here, amid the swirl of cafe voices, the scent of cheap wine, and the constant hum of artistic ambition, Suzanne found herself drawn into new circles. She was not yet a model, not yet the muse whose face would be captured by Renoir and Toulouse-Lautrec. She was a young woman looking for a way to step beyond the limits set upon her. Montmartre offered something no other place had, a sense that the world, though chaotic and unpredictable, might allow room for someone as restless as she. Every alleyway murmured with possibility. Every studio window glowed with questions. Every face, familiar or strange, seemed to carry a story she might one day paint if only she could teach her hands to speak the language of colors. These early years formed the soil from which her future self would grow, though she could not have known it then. When her mother chastised her for wandering too far, she only smiled and promised to return before dark. In truth, darkness was when she felt most alive. She would stand atop the hill and look out over the city, the lights spreading like constellations across the earth. The weight of her difficult beginnings pressed heavily on her, but beneath that burden pulsed a quiet certainty that she was meant for something more than washing linens and scrubbing floors. Perhaps she felt this as a whisper in her bones, a soft stirring that spoke of hidden paths. Or perhaps it was born from watching the artists who passed her in the street, their arms full of canvases, their eyes full of distant dreams. She envied them, not for their talent or fame, but for the freedom their craft seemed to grant them. Her motivations at this stage of her life were woven from threads of desperation and curiosity. She was determined to escape the narrow fate offered to women of her class. She wanted a life where her choices mattered, where her spirit could move without permission. But beneath this longing was another impulse, one she did not yet recognize as the root of her future, the compulsion to create. Sometimes she would draw in the margins of old newspapers or scratch lines into the dirt with a stick. She observed how light shaped the faces around her, how shadows lengthened across the pavement, how a simple gesture could reveal a lifetime of sorrow or hope. These observations were not yet art, but they were seeds waiting to breach the soil. As Suzanne grew, so did her refusal to be shaped by expectations. Her mother often scolded her for being too direct, too impulsive, too unwilling to follow the safer path. But Suzanne had no patience for caution. Life had shown her that those who hesitated were forgotten. It was this determination that eventually led her toward the world of painters, a world where she would become both subject and defiant creator. Her origins traced a path marked by uncertainty, yet they also forged the strength she would rely upon when the temptations and dangers of Montmartre threatened to swallow her. In every struggle of her childhood lies the echo of the woman she would become, a woman who refused to yield, who refused to remain invisible. And now, as the pale morning light touches her face while she walks, clutching the crinkled sketch she found on the cobblestones, one cannot help but wonder whether some part of her already sensed the destiny ahead, even if only as a distant murmur she could not name. The wind tugs at her hair, lifting a few strands like faint signals of what lies beyond, and the sketch in her hand trembles again, as though guiding her toward a life she has not yet imagined. The sketch in Suzanne's hand fluttered like a timid bird as she reached the crest of the hill, and for a moment she paused, sensing that the wind carried something more than the usual scent of coal smoke and wet stone. It seemed to whisper caution, though she had never been one to heed warnings. Below her, the city stretched in a pale haze, its rooftops softened by the early morning light. Paris was awakening, but she felt as though she alone walked between two worlds, the one she had known, shaped by hardship and routine, and another that called to her with the faint promise of transformation. This was the turning point, though such thresholds rarely announce themselves with certainty. Instead, they slip quietly into one's life, disguised as an ordinary day, a simple choice, a chance encounter that shifts everything bit by bit until the past becomes unrecognizable. For Suzanne, it began when poverty and ambition pushed her to a decision that would draw her into both danger and possibility, a decision to offer her body not as a commodity, but as a vessel for artistic vision. She had heard whispers about the studios scattered across Montmartre, the places where painters gathered to chase light, form, and desire into shape. Some women earned modest wages by posing, though the work came with risks of its own. There were stories of drunken tempers, of promises broken, of tempers flaring beneath the brush. Yet there were also tales of escape, women who found freedom within those paint-scented rooms, who stepped into a world unlike any other. Suzanne, hungry for independence and hardened by years of uncertainty, recognized in these rumors a narrow but unmistakable doorway. She did not imagine herself immortalized in oil or admired in galleries. She simply recognized that modeling might offer a path that allowed her to live without bending her back in drudgery. And even then, some quiet part of her felt drawn to the idea of entering the spaces where images were born, where emotion was translated into strokes of color. But she also understood the danger, for the line between muse and possession was thin, and the world had never been gentle to women who walked too close to the edge. Her first steps into this life were hesitant. She followed the advice of a seamstress who had once posed and knew which artists paid fairly and which ones to avoid. The seamstress warned her to keep her wits sharp, to say little, and never to trust a promise made during the late hours of wine and paint. Suzanne listened, though she had already learned these lessons in other corners of her childhood. When she arrived at her first studio, she felt the air shift around her. The room was small, cluttered, its walls covered in canvases that leaned like silent witnesses. The painter, a man with tired eyes and unkempt hair, barely looked at her at first, but as she stepped closer to the window light, his gaze sharpened. She had that effect on people even then, long before she understood the power she carried. There was something in the set of her shoulders, in the clarity of her stare, that challenged expectation. It was as though she refused to shrink before the male gaze, and this defiance intrigued artists who sought to capture something more spirited than passive beauty. Standing motionless for long stretches was harder than she anticipated, her muscles trembling as the minutes passed. But beneath the discomfort, she felt a strange awakening. Watching the painter interpret her posture, her expression, her silhouette, she sensed the faint stirrings of another calling. She did not yet know how to hold a pencil with the precision of an artist, but she memorized every movement of his hand, the way he squinted at the canvas, the way he stepped back and tilted his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Suzanne was not content simply to be an object within the frame. She wanted to understand the process that turned flesh into form, breath into pigment. As she moved from studio to studio in the following months, her name began to circulate quietly among the artists of Montmartre. She attracted attention not only for her striking presence, but for her sharp insights. Some painters found her unsettling. They expected silence from models, compliance, a willingness to become whatever the painter imagined. But Suzanne had the audacity to ask questions, to comment on the work, to offer observations that revealed an emerging understanding of line and color. This was not welcomed by everyone. Some dismissed her as insolent. Others, however, saw in her the beginnings of something rare. It was one such encounter that marked the true, subtle turning point. She had been asked to pose for a painter whose reputation was both respected and feared. His temper was unpredictable, but his skill was undeniable. When Suzanne arrived at his studio, she expected the usual mixture of arrogance and distraction. Instead, she found herself drawn to a canvas in the corner. It depicted a scene from a cafe, the figures blurred in motion, their faces half lost in shadow. Without thinking, she murmured that the shadows seemed too heavy for the light source. The painter turned sharply, ready to scold her, but the words froze on his lips. Something in her tone, quiet but certain, drew his interest. He asked her to explain. She did, hesitant at first, then with greater detail as she described how the lantern in the painting should have cast a gentler glow. The painter listened, and though he did not praise her, neither did he dismiss her. That exchanged glance, half curious and half wary, marked the moment she stepped beyond the role the world had assigned her. The dangers that accompanied this moment were not only external. Within herself, she felt a shift, an awakening, a widening of the path she might walk. She began to realize that the life of a model, though fraught with risk, placed her at the threshold of something deeper. Artists began to notice the intensity in her eyes, the way her presence seemed to challenge them to see more than they expected. Some found this unsettling. Others found it irresistible. It was during these early days that she first met Toulouse-Lautrec, whose gaze was both analytical and oddly tender. He saw in her not merely a subject, but a story, a force, a contradiction waiting to be explored. Though their bond would deepen in time, its seed was planted here, in this turning point where Suzanne stepped into the orbit of those who would shape her fate. Yet even as these connections formed, the danger around her sharpened. The bohemian world was not romantic in the way later generations imagined it. It bristled with jealousy, intoxication, broken promises, and the constant threat of reputational ruin. A woman without family protection, without money, walked a precarious line. Every gesture could be misunderstood. Every rumor could cast a long shadow. Still, Suzanne did not retreat. She navigated this world as though she were crossing a tightrope, balancing desire and caution, vulnerability and defiance. And beneath it all, she carried the quiet conviction that she was meant for more than posing. This conviction grew stronger each time she watched a painter struggle to capture the truth of a moment. Each time she saw how art could reveal or distort reality. She found herself lingering after sessions, studying abandoned sketches, imagining how she would alter them if given the chance. The act of observation became a hunger, the hunger became a need, and the need became a promise she made to herself in silence. She would learn to create no matter what the world expected of her. The winds of Montmartre rose again that evening, carrying with them the scents of wine, tobacco, and distant laughter. Suzanne stood outside the studio, the city unfolding beneath her, and for the first time she allowed herself to imagine a life that belonged to her alone. As she descended the hill, the sky darkening above her, the sketch in her hand trembled once more, its charcoal lines smudged by her thumb, as though absorbing the weight of her unspoken vow. The sketch Suzanne carried had begun to lose its form, the charcoal smearing into a ghostly haze across the paper. Yet she kept it close, as though it contained something of herself she had not yet put into words. Days passed into weeks, and the world of the studios wrapped itself slowly around her life, binding her to its rhythms and desires. It was during this time that her rise began in earnest, though she would not have recognized it as such. To her, it was simply survival, a pattern of mornings spent under the scrutinizing eyes of painters, afternoons wandering the winding streets of Montmartre, and evenings filled with thoughts she could not yet speak aloud. But beneath this surface, a deeper current stirred, the emergence of her own artistic voice. It whispered to her whenever she lingered over a discarded sketch, whenever she watched a painter's frustration flare as a color refused to obey, whenever she caught herself imagining how she would reshape a shadow or sharpen a contour. This was the hidden rise, the quiet ascent that preceded the louder, more disruptive transformations to come. In the studios, her presence became increasingly known. Artists recognized something unusual in her stillness, a kind of alertness that gave their work a different tension. Some believed her to be difficult, accusing her of holding herself too stiffly or staring too intently at the canvas as they worked. Others found her gaze invigorating, a challenge to their complacency. Renoir was among the latter. When he first asked her to sit for him, she arrived expecting the usual mixture of flattery and condescension. Instead, she found him attentive, almost reverent, observing her with the patience of someone studying the movement of light through water. Renoir saw not only beauty, but an intensity that set her apart from other models. And in his attempts to capture it, he revealed to Suzanne the complicated relationship between artist and subject. She understood that she was not simply being looked at. She was being interpreted, reshaped by another's vision, her own identity blurred to fit the painter's ideal. This realization brought its own discomfort. While posing for Renoir's dance at Bougival, she felt herself dissolving into someone else's composition, an image crafted to reflect joy, romance, harmony, sensations she did not always feel. There was a dissonance between the person she knew herself to be and the figure blooming on the canvas. Often after she left the studio, she walked along the Seine and stared at her reflection in the water, searching for the woman others believed they saw in her. How strange it was to be captured so many times, she thought, and yet remain unseen in any true sense. This tension formed the first crack in the role she had accepted. She wanted more than to be admired or displayed. She wanted to hold the brush. She wanted to decide what truths to reveal and which ones to conceal. But her rise was not defined solely by creative awakening. It was marked also by secrets and scandals, the darker threads that wove themselves into the fabric of her early years in Montmartre. Though the artists she worked with revered her vitality, they were also captivated by her defiance. She moved through the cafes with a confidence that unsettled the women who served drinks nearby and fascinated the men who watched her pass. Rumors gathered as quickly as brushstrokes across a canvas. Some whispered that she was too bold for her own good. Others accused her of becoming entangled with certain painters in ways that were not easily spoken aloud. She shrugged off these murmurs, for she knew how quickly jealousy and misunderstanding could distort truth. Yet the whispers followed her everywhere, clinging to her like the scent of turpentine that soaked into her clothes. It was during this period that her affair with one of the painters began, at a time when she was still learning how deeply intimacy could complicate artistic relationships. The man was married, older, and well-respected. Suzanne, drawn to his intellect and restless temperament, entered into the affair with a mix of curiosity and longing. But the relationship soon shifted into something more volatile. His admiration for her spirit often turned into attempts to control it. He praised her when she behaved as he wished and scolded her when she strayed from his expectations. It was a dynamic she recognized with a sinking heart, for she had seen similar patterns unravel lives around her. The affair brought moments of passion, yes, but also nights of bitter arguments, days when she left the studio with trembling hands, wondering why she had allowed herself to be drawn into such entanglement. This turmoil, however, fed her growing artistic hunger. She began sketching in secret, using scraps of paper stolen from the edges of studios, charcoal nubs discarded by painters, or whatever she could find. She hid these early attempts beneath her mattress, in her coat pockets, or tucked behind loose floorboards. Her lines were rough, uneven, but each stroke carried the urgency of someone trying to carve her own path through the world. She drew what she saw, not what others expected her to see. The fatigue etched in the faces of street vendors, the exhaustion of laundresses hauling bundles through rain-soaked alleys, the defiance in the posture of fellow models who endured the same double-edged gaze she knew so well. Her work was raw, unpolished, but unmistakably honest, and it carried within it the seeds of her future rebellion. This secret world of drawings gave her a sense of grounding that the tumult of her public life could not. She felt herself opening like a door that had been locked for years, and yet she also felt the shadows gathering around her. Her relationships became more strained, especially with those who relied on her compliance. Friends warned her to be careful, to avoid provoking the wrong people, to accept that a model's life offered limited room for defiance. But Suzanne could not quiet the fire building within her. She had tasted the intoxicating freedom of creation, and she could no longer imagine a life without it. One evening, after a particularly heated exchange with the painter who had once professed admiration for her, she returned home, trembling with anger. She tore off her shoes, reached beneath her mattress, and pulled out her sketches. Sitting on the floor, she spread them around her like fallen leaves. For a long time, she stared at them, studying the faces, the lines, the flawed yet vivid emotions she had captured. In that moment, she realized that these private works, though small and imperfect, were truer representations of her than any painting she had posed for. They carried her voice in a way her image on someone else's canvas never could. This clarity, fragile yet powerful, marked the deeper turning point. She resolved to learn more, to push her abilities, to seek instruction where she could find it, even if it meant challenging the boundaries that society imposed. She understood now that her identity as a muse was only one part of her life, a role that had helped her survive but could no longer contain her. She wanted to paint, to shape her own vision of the world, even if doing so placed her at odds with the very men who had once admired her. And so her rise continued, not with triumph, but with tension, secrecy, and a growing defiance. She left the studio late one night, the smell of turpentine lingering in her hair, the streets of Montmartre echoing faintly with distant laughter. The sketch in her pocket fluttered in the breeze, its lines worn but persistent, as though urging her forward into the shadows of a life she was only beginning to claim. The night air clung to Suzanne's skin as she stepped out into the dim labyrinth of Montmartre, the distant lamps shimmering like trembling stars caught between breaths. She wrapped her coat tighter, though it was not the cold that troubled her, but the weight of a realization that had been growing within her for months, perhaps years, without her noticing. The world she inhabited had begun to shift, not with sudden violence, but with the slow and undeniable settling of truth. Her life as a model had given her entry into the studios of painters who ruled the Parisian imagination, but it had also shown her the limits of admiration. She was treasured when she embodied their visions and discarded the moment she insisted on her own. Yet beneath this bitter knowledge, a strange strength stirred, urging her forward even as the shadows thickened around her. It was during this time, when her relationships frayed and her ambitions sharpened, that she entered the orbit of Edgar Degas, a man whose impact on her would shape the course of her life more deeply than any lover or critic. Their meeting did not arrive like a lightning strike. It unfolded in a quiet corner of a studio, in the hush of concentration, in the fractured glow of late afternoon light. And in that quiet, something within Suzanne began to awaken with a force that both frightened and steadied her. Degas was not drawn to her beauty, nor to the mischievous spark that attracted many men. Instead, he noticed her eyes, their alertness, their refusal to look away, their uncommon willingness to meet his scrutiny without flinching. Suzanne had been invited to sit for him through the recommendation of another painter who admired her discipline. When she entered Degas' studio for the first time, she felt a stillness that differed from the chaotic energy of other workshops. The dust particles drifted through the light like tiny ghosts. The smell of paint, chalk, and turpentine hung in the air, and Degas stood before a canvas, not acknowledging her arrival until he had finished adjusting a line. Only then did he glance toward her with a nod that was closer to acceptance than welcome. It was not affection he offered her, but respect, the rarest and most precious gesture she had ever received from a painter. As the hours passed, she realized that he studied the world with a meticulous gaze that mirrored her own inner impulses. He approached his art with seriousness, intent, and a sensitivity sharpened by solitude. In him, she recognized a kindred spirit, someone who understood the labor behind beauty, the sorrow beneath grace. Yet it was not simply his work that altered the course of her life. Degas saw in her drawings, those secret scraps she had guarded for years, a potential that she herself had barely dared to claim. One afternoon, when she believed he was out of the room, she approached a desk covered with pastels and examined their colors. She had touched nothing, yet he noticed her interest the moment he returned. Instead of scolding her for her curiosity, he asked a question that would echo through her memory like a bell. "You draw, do you not?" She hesitated, unsure whether to deny or confess. In her world, an admission could invite ridicule or danger. But Degas waited patiently, his gaze steady, offering no judgment. Finally, she nodded. He asked to see her work, and she resisted at first, fearing that her rough attempts would invite the dismissive laughter she had endured before. But Degas insisted, not with force, but with a quiet certainty that unsettled her. When she finally presented her sketches, she expected him to hand them back after a brief, polite glance. Instead, he studied them in silence for a long time, his brow furrowed, his fingers tracing the lines without touching them. When he spoke, his voice was softer than she had ever heard it. "You see," he murmured, in a way that many do not. Those words did more for her than any passionate declaration of love she had ever received. They carved open a space inside her, a space where possibility breathed and expanded. Degas did not offer her empty praise. He did not charm or patronize. He spoke with the authority of someone who had mastered his craft and with the sincerity of someone who valued truth above flattery. And so their connection grew, not through romance, but through a shared devotion to the act of creation. He encouraged her, guided her, challenged her. He taught her how to hold a pencil, not as a tool of imitation, but as an instrument for revealing the world's concealed rhythms. He showed her how to observe shapes, how to honor imperfections, how to allow emotion to surface without forcing it. And he lent her materials, pastels, chalk, paper of a quality she had never touched before. These gestures were not tokens of generosity, but acknowledgments of her potential. They marked the beginning of her transformation from model to artist. Yet even as her artistic life bloomed, her personal world grew more turbulent. Her love affairs, already complicated, turned volatile as men around her sensed her shifting independence. Some who once sought her company now resented the changes in her. They expected her to remain the vivacious muse, the woman whose laughter filled cafes and whose presence ignited conversations. But Suzanne was withdrawing into herself, spending long nights sketching beneath dim lamplight, practicing symbols and forms that resisted easy interpretation. This withdrawal confused those who wished to possess her. Their frustration sometimes erupted in anger, accusations, or desperate pleas. Suzanne navigated these emotional storms with a mixture of guilt and resolve. She cared for some of them, yet she could not sacrifice her emerging identity to soothe their insecurities. She had discovered a landscape far richer than the fleeting comfort of admiration, the solitude of creation, the silence where images formed before making themselves known. This new devotion came at a cost. Friends complained that she had become distant. Lovers accused her of growing cold. Even her mother, who depended on her financially, questioned her choices. But Suzanne knew that the path she walked would demand sacrifices no one else could understand. As her skill developed, she grew bolder in her exploration of subjects. She sketched women at work, women resting, women who bore the weight of life without complaint. She sketched her own son, Maurice, capturing the vulnerability and mischief etched in his features. She sketched the elderly neighbors in her building, her own friends, and sometimes even herself, though these self-studies remained hidden. And as her lines strengthened, so too did the storms within her. Her relationship with one lover ended in a bitter quarrel that left her trembling. Her nights grew darker as the emotional chaos blended with artistic intensity, creating a cycle that both fueled and exhausted her. She began to understand that the path of an artist was not merely a pursuit of beauty, but also a confrontation with one's own depths, fears, and unresolved desires. Degas recognized this in her and offered guidance, though his mentorship remained distant, never intruding upon her inner world. He knew, perhaps better than anyone, that true artistic maturation required solitude. The world around her, however, continued to press its demands. Her son grew older and more perceptive, watching her with a mixture of admiration and longing. He sensed the turbulence even when she tried to conceal it. And though she loved him fiercely, she did not always know how to show it. Her attention was divided between survival, ambition, and a growing sense of responsibility. This tension would deepen in years to come, forming one of the most complex and painful threads of her life. For now, though, Maurice simply observed, absorbing each moment with the quiet understanding of a child who sees more than adults expect. One evening, he stood in the doorway of her small workspace, watching her bent over a drawing. The lamplight revealed the determination etched across her face. He said nothing, yet his silence seemed to ask a question she could not bear to answer. She turned away, unable to explain the distance between them, the distance carved by necessity, exhaustion, and the still fragile sense of self she was nurturing. Outside, the night deepened. The city murmured with its usual mixture of laughter and sorrow. Suzanne set down her pencil and closed her eyes. The path ahead was uncertain, tangled with danger and possibility. Yet she felt the stirring of a quiet power within her, a force she no longer wished to suppress. And as she opened her eyes again, she sensed someone watching her. Not a lover, not a critic, not a neighbor, but her son, still standing in the doorway, still silently asking who his mother would become. The faint click of Maurice's door lingered like a pulse in the silence, and though the sound was slight, it carried with it the weight of a shifting world, as if something familiar had slipped into shadow without warning. Suzanne stood alone in the dim room, surrounded by the scent of oil and chalk, her hands still trembling from the intensity of her recent quarrel with a critic who had dismissed her early works as the clumsy imitations of a woman who mistakes stubbornness for talent. She had not yet shown her paintings in any formal exhibition, but rumors of her progress circulated among the artists of Montmartre, and with those rumors came both admiration and hostility. She understood that criticism was an inevitable companion to ambition, yet she felt each blow as a reopening of old wounds, the wounds of poverty, invisibility, and the years spent as a muse whose identity was crafted by others. The world around her was beginning to shift in ways she could not fully control. Her relationships grew taut as strings pulled too tightly, the studios that once welcomed her now brimming with quiet resentments, and the whispers that floated through the cafes carried a sharper edge. It was as though her determination to paint had stirred unease in those who had once felt secure in defining her place. Yet within this turbulence, another transformation brewed, quiet but steady, and the tide of her life began to pull her further into the depths where reputation and vulnerability collided. As her artistic skills sharpened, she increasingly sensed the world pushing back against her. Critics found her work bold, yes, but also unsettling. They claimed her lines carried an unrefined ferocity that felt inappropriate coming from a woman. Some muttered that her paintings revealed too much of the female form, too much of the labor worn into women's bodies, too much of the truth that polite society preferred to soften. In these opinions, she heard the echo of the constraints that had shaped her life, the demand that women remain gentle, modest, and compliant in both body and spirit. But Suzanne had never been gentle in the ways they expected. Her art was not meant to soothe, it was meant to see. And what she saw did not align with the fantasies of critics or collectors. Her growing defiance came at a cost. Friends drifted away, disapproving of her long hours, her distant manner, or the intensity that stretched her moods thin. Her mother, who had long depended on her financially, complained that Suzanne was becoming irresponsible, losing sight of practical concerns. Suzanne listened, but felt torn between the guilt of familial duty and the ache of her creative hunger. She knew that her mother spoke from fear, from the memory of years scraping by in cheap rooms where hunger gnawed at their stomachs. But Suzanne also knew that if she abandoned her emerging identity now, she might never recover it. And woven into all of this was her complex relationship with Maurice, who seemed to stand on the threshold between boyhood and something more unknowable. He watched her with eyes that reflected both admiration and confusion, as though he sensed that his mother was slipping into a realm he could not follow. In the studios, the tension thickened. A few artists continued to treat her with genuine respect, acknowledging the talent they saw taking form, but others bristled at her assent, interpreting her confidence as arrogance. They were accustomed to women who played roles: lover, muse, model, ornament. Suzanne, unwilling to remain within these confines, became a source of discomfort. She recalled one afternoon when she walked into a cafe where several painters had gathered. Their conversation faltered as she entered. One of them, emboldened by wine, remarked that a woman's ambitions spoil her charm. The comment floated through the room like smoke. Suzanne felt a flicker of anger, not because the remark surprised her, but because it revealed the gap between their admiration for her face and their disdain for her mind. She responded with a calmness that struck them silent. "Charm," she said, "is a shallow currency for a woman to live on." Then she left, feeling both wounded and empowered. Her relationships grew more tumultuous in this period. Lovers who once praised her independence now accused her of coldness or distraction. One argued with her for hours, insisting she had changed too much, that she no longer gave him the attention he deserved. She listened, her jaw tightening, aware that his need for dominance clashed with her need for space. When he demanded that she choose between him and her art, she walked away without a backward glance. That night, alone in her small room, she wept, not for him, but for the exhaustion of choosing herself again and again in a world determined to misunderstand such choices. Yet amid all the turmoil, her art flourished. Her lines grew firmer, her sense of perspective more intuitive. She discovered how to capture not only the physical presence of her subjects, but the emotional weight they carried. Women bent over laundry revealed resilience as profound as any hero in classical art. Children's faces, smudged with soot or fatigue, carried stories generations deep. Suzanne understood suffering because she had lived it, and in her work, suffering transformed, not into something beautiful or poetic, but into something real, honored and unhidden. Still, The world had not softened toward her. In fact, the tides of gossip rose higher. Some whispered that she had broken too many hearts. Others claimed she used men for their resources, ignoring that she had survived for years with little more than grit and determination. A few malign stories circulated about her motherhood, accusing her of neglecting Maurice for the sake of her ambitions. These words pierced her deeply, for motherhood was the one role she approached with both tenderness and fear. She loved her son fiercely, but she also knew that love alone could not shield him from the instability of their lives. One evening, after a long day sketching in Degas's studio, she returned home to find Maurice standing near the window, the faint lamplight outlining his small frame. He turned to her with an expression she could not decipher. She approached him slowly, unsure whether he carried a question or a complaint. Instead, he simply said, "You look tired." The simplicity of the remark struck her harder than any criticism she had faced all day. She knelt beside him, resting her hand on his shoulder. "I am," she whispered, "but I am trying." He nodded, though she sensed that he did not fully understand the battles she fought. Perhaps he never would. She kissed his forehead, feeling the unspoken distance between them, a distance neither wanted but both felt growing. As night deepened, Suzanne sat alone near her sketches, listening to the faint murmur of the streets below. The world was changing, pushing her into places she had never imagined. The shifting relationships, the conflicts with critics, the strain of motherhood, and the rising flame of artistic passion pressed upon her with equal force. Yet somewhere within this chaos, she sensed the approach of a greater turning, a moment that would propel her beyond the boundaries of her early life. She could not name it yet, but she felt it gathering like a storm at the horizon, its winds beginning to stir the edges of her world. The faint click of Maurice's door echoed once more in her memory, a reminder that the next chapter of her life would not unfold gently, but with the relentless pull of necessity and fate. The wine on the forgotten glass had dried into a thin crimson shadow, a trace of an argument that still felt suspended in the air, as though the room itself refused to release the memory. Suzanne sat at the edge of her narrow bed, fingers pressed against her temples, trying to steady the tremor beneath her ribs. The quarrel had erupted without warning, the kind born not from one mistake, but from years of pressure, expectation, and unspoken resentments. It left her exhausted in a way no long day of modeling or painting ever had. The lamp beside her flickered, casting uneven shapes across the wall. Shadows stretched and curled like restless thoughts, filling the room with a tension she could neither name nor escape. She had long believed that hardship came from the outside world, from the critics, from poverty, from the judgments that followed a woman like a stray dog hungry for scraps. But she was beginning to understand that some battles grew from within, fueled by her own ambitions, doubts, and unresolved fears. And it was in this fragile moment, shaken from the quarrel that still echoed faintly through the walls, that the deeper tragedies of her life began to surface, taking shape like figures emerging from fog. The argument had been with a man who claimed to love her, though his love was woven with threads of jealousy and frustration. He had accused her of neglect, of withdrawing into her art until she no longer had room for him. She listened, at first silently, then with growing anger, unable to accept the idea that her passion for creation should be treated like a trespass. He demanded that she choose, as though her identity were divisible, as though she could carve away the part of herself that had only recently begun to breathe freely. When she refused, his bitterness spilled into accusations that cut deeply. Accusations about her mothering, her ambition, her past. Words designed to wound, and they succeeded. When he finally stormed out, leaving the glass tipped on its side and the room thick with silence, Suzanne felt as though a door had closed behind her with a finality she had not prepared for. But quarrels such as this were never isolated. They echoed into other parts of her life, stirring old regrets and hidden sorrows. Her son, Maurice, hearing the raised voices, had slipped quietly back into his room, closing the door so gently it created only a faint click. That small sound haunted her more than the argument itself. It carried the weight of a childhood marked by uncertainty, by the unpredictability of the adults around him, by a mother whose love was fierce but often stretched thin. Suzanne knew the world judged her for the choices she made, choices that had shaken her stability, choices that seemed reckless to those who had never lived her hardships. Yet she also understood that she was doing her best within the narrow space life had afforded her. Still, the fear lingered that Maurice, who had inherited both her sensitivity and her restlessness, would one day carry scars she had not intended to give him. Her thoughts drifted to earlier years when Maurice was a small boy clinging to her skirts, eyes wide with curiosity and hunger. She had done everything she could for him, working long hours, taking on any job that allowed her to feed and shelter them. But life in Montmartre was unforgiving. Artists, lovers, and neighbors came and went with little regard for the child who watched them, learning unspoken lessons in instability and passion. Suzanne herself had never known the security of a family, and she struggled to offer one. She loved her son with a depth that startled her, yet she feared that her own wounds might spill into his world. And now, as she sat in the dim glow of her room, the sound of his closing door felt like a veil drawn over that fear, as if reminding her that love, no matter how fierce, could not shield him entirely. Her relationships with lovers were not the only sources of turmoil. Her bond with the artistic world also began to fracture. While some praised her emerging style, others condemned it with surprising hostility. It was during this period that a critic, having seen one of her early paintings displayed informally in a friend's studio, wrote a scathing remark in a small publication. He claimed that her work lacked refinement, that her lines were too forceful for a woman, and that her themes were tainted by the shadows of her past. The phrasing struck her like a blow. It was not merely an attack on her art, but on her very being, on the hardships she had endured, on the courage she had mustered to rise from the life she had been born into. She crumpled the paper in her hand, her throat tight. She had known criticism would come. She had not expected it to feel so personal, so cruelly intimate. These words followed her into the night, mingling with the remnants of the earlier quarrel. She walked the streets of Montmartre long after the cafes had closed, the moon casting a pale sheen across the cobblestones. A few drunken voices drifted from distant corners, but she avoided them. Instead, she wandered toward a familiar spot overlooking the city below. Paris stretched beneath her like a vast, breathing organism, full of both tenderness and sharp edges. As she gazed at the lights shimmering along the river, she questioned whether she had the strength to continue pushing against the world's expectations. Was it worth the loneliness, the conflict, the constant need to defend her ambitions? A whisper of doubt tugged at her, faint but persistent. Yet even as it pulled, another force, deeper, more elemental, rose to meet it. She remembered the first time she drew a figure without guidance, how the lines had seemed to flow from her hand as though guided by an instinct she had carried since childhood. She remembered Degas' quiet encouragement, his unwavering belief in her talent. She remembered the joy she felt when a sketch captured something true, something unfiltered and raw. These memories anchored her, reminding her that art was not merely a pursuit, but a necessity. It was the language she had long searched for, the only way she knew to express the tangled threads of her existence. Returning to her room hours later, she found it unchanged, yet something within her had settled. She approached the fallen wine glass and righted it, though the stain remained like a small wound on the wood. She picked up her charcoal and sat before a fresh page, her hands still shaking but determined. She drew not from a model or a memory, but from the tension rising within her, the collision of love, anger, fear, and resilience. The lines spilled out quickly, forming a figure that seemed both fragile and fierce. She did not know who it represented. Perhaps it was herself. Perhaps it was every woman who had been told she was too much or not enough. When she finished, she sat back, breath unsteady. The figure on the page looked wounded but unbroken, shaped by conflict yet standing firm. She wondered then whether all creation required a measure of suffering, whether artists were destined to navigate storms that others never saw. The city still murmured faintly outside, the sky beginning to pale at the edges. Suzanne set down her charcoal and closed her eyes, exhaustion washing over her. But as sleep began to pull her under, she sensed that the greatest tests of her life were approaching, the tests that would force her to confront not only external obstacles, but the deepest fractures within herself. The wine glass, now upright but stained, caught the first glimmer of dawn, holding its unresolved reflection like a quiet, unanswered question. The quill scratching across the old newspaper had already begun to fade when Suzanne first noticed how carelessly her story was being retold by others, and how easily the truths of her life dissolved into rumor the moment they left her hands. The morning light slanted across her modest studio, illuminating the curled edges of clippings she had collected, snippets of exhibitions, passing mentions of her name, fragments of criticism both flattering and cruel. She'd never sought fame, yet she could not ignore the peculiar sensation of seeing herself refracted through the opinions of men who had never paused to understand her. Some wrote of her rise with admiration, calling her bold, unconventional, a force whose presence unsettled the artistic circles of Montmartre. Others, however, clung to narratives spun from assumptions or whispered scandals, eager to reduce her ambition to the predictable tale of a wayward model seeking attention. And it was in the growing chasm between these versions of her life that she discovered a darker truth. History, even when it unfolds before one's very eyes, rarely records itself accurately. It is shaped by voices with power, and she knew all too well that women like her seldom controlled the pen. The controversial truths of Suzanne's life did not lie merely in her relationships or the whispers that drifted through cafes. They lived in the spaces where her art confronted expectations, in the defiance embedded in each stroke of her brush, in the choices she made to assert her autonomy in a world that had not granted her permission. She sensed that her story would be told not as the evolution of a gifted and perceptive artist, but as a cautionary tale woven from disobedience. And indeed, many who spoke of her did so with a mixture of fascination and hostility. They repeated tales of her relationships as though love were her primary rebellion, ignoring her discipline, her hours of practice, the countless sketches hidden beneath her mattress, the nights she spent working by lamplight until her eyes burned. They preferred a narrative more titillating than truthful, a narrative that reduced her to the sum of her scandals. What history often omits is the courage it took for a woman like Suzanne to survive in Montmartre. The world saw her as fierce, tempestuous, unpredictable. But beneath that exterior lived a woman who had endured hunger, displacement, exploitation, and heartbreak long before she entered the studios of Paris. She had raised a child alone in a cramped room where the walls remained thin enough for neighbors to overhear every argument, every tear. Her survival was not the result of charm or manipulation, as some implied, but of sheer resilience. She had endured because she refused to collapse, because she carried the unyielding belief that her life could hold more than the limitations imposed upon her. And yet, even as she built her craft with determination, the stories circulating about her grew in ways she could not control. One rumor that trailed her with particular persistence concerned the paternity of her son. The truth that she herself did not know was too complicated for the world to accept. Instead, people filled the gap with speculation, assigning the role of father to whichever artist or lover suited their preferred narrative. Some claimed it was a wealthy man who had abandoned her. Others pointed to a painter whose name carried enough notoriety to make the gossip more satisfying. Suzanne ignored these claims publicly, but privately they pained her, not because they questioned her past, but because they overshadowed the devotion she had given to her child. Maurice was not the product of shame or secrecy. He was the one constant light in her life. Yet the world, hungry for scandal, rarely acknowledged the tenderness between them. Other truths remained buried simply because no one cared to ask. They did not ask about the times she went without food so that Maurice could eat, or the nights she walked long distances through rain to reach a distant studio where she hoped to earn a few francs. They did not ask how often she had been dismissed or humiliated by artists who believed that a model's mind was unworthy of consideration. They did not ask how many times she had been told she could not paint, should not paint, and would never paint. These omissions formed a quiet ache within her, an ache that deepened each time she saw herself portrayed as reckless or ungrateful. She longed for someone, just one person, to recognize the layers of her life without simplifying them into convenient conclusions. The controversial truths also touched her artistic journey. Her early works were considered too raw, too unrefined, too confrontational. Some critics accused her of imitating the men she admired, ignoring the fact that her style bore a distinct tension, a blend of strength and vulnerability that was uniquely her own. Others found her choice of subjects improper. A woman painting the female body was, in their eyes, an act of provocation. They preferred women painted through the comforting filter of male desire, softened into idealized beauty. Suzanne's figures, however, stood unapologetically in their own presence. They were ordinary women, working, resting, existing, captured without adornment. She painted them with a respect the world often denied them, and for this, she was judged harshly. The truth that history rarely records is that Suzanne did not seek to challenge the world. She simply refused to lie. But honesty, in its purest form, often appears as defiance. She did not paint for admiration or for controversy. She painted because the world inside her demanded expression, and the world outside her, in response, demanded that she justify her existence. One evening, while reviewing a stack of newspapers containing both praise and condemnation, she felt a wave of fatigue wash over her. She wondered whether the effort to defend her truth was worth the emotional toll. Was it possible, she thought, that her story would be remembered only through the distortions of others? The idea unsettled her. She imagined her name drifting through time, stripped of nuance, reduced to the caricature of a rebellious muse who dared too much and accomplished too little. The thought weighed heavily on her chest, yet as she sat in the quiet of her studio, surrounded by the scattered fragments of her life, she sensed something else, a subtle but persistent desire to continue shaping her own narrative. She gathered the newspaper clippings and placed them in a drawer, not as keepsakes, but as reminders of the world she navigated. Then she returned to her easel. Before her, a blank canvas waited, its surface untouched and expectant. She dipped her brush into the paint and began to work, each stroke deliberate, each line infused with a quiet defiance. If the world refused to understand her, then her art would speak for her. It would tell the truths she could not express in words. It would resist distortion. It would endure. Outside, the night wind stirred, brushing against her window like a whisper from a distant, uncertain future. And near her hand, the quill she had used to annotate the newspaper rested beside an unfinished letter, its ink drying in a delicate, unresolved flourish. The canvas turned to face the wall held its silence with the quiet dignity of a sealed confession. Suzanne stood before it, fingers grazing the wood of the frame as though the painting itself were breathing. She had placed it there the night before, unable to bear the weight of its presence, for it held truths she had not yet found the courage to accept. In the aftermath of the storms that had shaken her, arguments with lovers, cruel remarks from critics, the unexpected vulnerabilities revealed in her own son's eyes. She found herself unusually fragile, as if the foundations she had built so fiercely were shifting beneath her feet. Yet fragility, she reminded herself, was not the same as defeat. It was simply a threshold between what had been and what must come next. And now, as she stood alone in the morning quiet, she felt the first stirrings of a slow rebuilding, a gathering of her scattered strength, an inward settling after the tumult. If the early years of her artistic journey had been marked by struggle, defiance, and conflict, then this moment marked the beginning of her quiet aftermath, a time when she would return to herself with a steadiness shaped by experience rather than by instinct alone. In the days that followed, Suzanne withdrew from the noise of Montmartre. She visited fewer cafes, accepted fewer invitations, and avoided the studios where whispers clung to the air like smoke. Instead, she devoted her time to the small sanctuary of her workspace, where the world felt contained enough for her to breathe. She spent long hours sketching, not with the frantic urgency of her earlier years, but with a more deliberate intention. Her lines grew calmer, more measured, as though her hand were rediscovering a rhythm that had been overshadowed by turmoil. This period of quiet did not erase her pain, but it softened its edges, allowing her to see her life from a slightly greater distance. She realized that she had been moving so quickly, caught between survival, ambition, and the unpredictable currents of love, that she had rarely allowed herself to pause. Now, in this stillness, she saw how deeply she had been shaped by her past, the relentless labor of her childhood, the struggle of raising Maurice alone, the years spent turning herself into a muse for others, and the fragile, emerging identity of the artist she was becoming. The canvas faced toward the wall symbolized a chapter she was not yet ready to confront, a work created during a period of deep emotional unrest, but turning it away had not erased its existence. It simply gave her space to gather herself before turning the canvas around again. Her withdrawal did not go unnoticed. Friends knocked at her door, puzzled by her seclusion. Some assumed she was ill. Others speculated that her latest heartbreak had undone her. Suzanne did not correct them. She did not feel obligated to explain her silence. Instead, she allowed herself to sink into it, trusting that the quiet would teach her something she had not yet learned. Degas, among the few who understood the nature of internal retreats, offered neither judgment nor advice. When he visited her one afternoon, he observed the unfinished work scattered across the room and remarked simply, "You are seeing differently." She nodded, grateful for his ability to perceive shifts without demanding explanations. During this period, she also revisited her earliest drawings, those rough sketches she had once hidden out of embarrassment. She spread them across the floor, studying the tentativeness of her younger hand. There was an innocence in those lines, but also a restlessness, an unmistakable craving for expression. Seeing them now, she felt a mixture of tenderness and sorrow. The girl who drew them had been hungry for recognition, frightened of failure, desperate to claim a place in a world that did not easily welcome her. The woman she had become was still hungry, still frightened, but no longer desperate. She no longer sought permission. She only sought truth. The quiet aftermath gave her time to recognize the emotional toll her life had exacted. She began to understand how each heartbreak had carved its own small hollow within her, how each disappointment had thickened her resolve, how each moment of joy had flickered briefly before dissolving into memory. It was a complex landscape, and she explored it slowly, often returning to the same moments in her mind with new perspective. She found herself reflecting not only on her relationships with men, but also on her relationship with Maurice. He had grown more distant lately, perhaps sensing her internal struggles. She longed to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but she feared intruding upon his own growing independence. She wondered whether he resented her absences or admired her determination. She wondered whether she was shaping him in ways she could not foresee. These questions lingered, unresolved, waiting for a future confrontation. The painting turned to the wall remained an unspoken presence throughout these days. Suzanne knew she would eventually face it again, that she would need to confront whatever truth she had embedded within its strokes. But for now, the act of turning away from it allowed her to rebuild her intuition, to remember why she painted in the first place. She began a new series of works focusing on simpler subjects, still lifes, figures at rest, the quiet gestures of everyday existence. These pieces carried a gentler tone, imbued with a sense of observation rather than declaration. She painted slowly, savoring the process rather than rushing toward completion. Each stroke felt like a step toward reclaiming her equilibrium. One afternoon, as she mixed pigments by the window, she noticed how the fading sunlight touched the edge of the turned canvas. The light lingered there briefly, almost tenderly, before slipping away. The moment felt symbolic, though she could not have explained why. She sensed that the time to revisit the painting was approaching, that she would soon be ready to confront the emotions she had buried within it. But she did not rush. She had learned something valuable in her stillness, that healing did not come through force, but through openness, through the willingness to sit with discomfort until it became familiar. Meanwhile, the world outside continued its restless motion. Montmartre buzzed with new art movements, new scandals, new faces arriving from distant corners of France. Painters debated in cafes, dancers practiced behind thin walls, poets scribbled verses on napkins. Suzanne watched from a distance, neither withdrawing entirely nor stepping back into the center of its chaos. She felt like a quiet observer of the life she had once moved through so urgently. And in this more measured state, she found clarity. Her rebuilding was not a retreat, but a gathering of strength, a necessary pause before the next rise. As evening fell one night, she lit a single candle and approached the canvas that had watched her in silence. She did not turn it around. She only rested her hand on the frame, feeling the grain of the wood beneath her fingers. The candle flame flickered gently, casting a soft glow across the back of the canvas, as if offering a small reassurance. She closed her eyes, breathing deeply, sensing that the moment to reveal the painting would come soon, when the shadows within her heart no longer felt so heavy. For now, she stepped back, letting the darkness settle. The canvas remained turned, holding its secrets, but the room around it felt different, calmer, fuller, ready for the next unfolding. The jar of cloudy turpentine sat on the table like an aging memory, its surface rippling softly whenever Suzanne brushed past it, as though responding to the unspoken weight in the room. She lifted a paintbrush from the jar and watched the diluted colors drip slowly back into the murky liquid, each droplet sinking into the opacity as if swallowed whole by time. Something about this quiet dissolution felt familiar, like a mirror held up to the fragments of her life she had spent the past months rearranging. Yet in this stillness, she sensed a shift, a stirring that rose not from despair, but from renewal. Her long period of withdrawal had left space for a new creative bloom to take shape, a slower, more deliberate blossoming, rooted in experience rather than impulse. In this season of her life, Suzanne began painting with a clarity she had never known before. Gone were the frantic lines of her early sketches, driven by the hunger to prove something. Gone was the tremor of insecurity that once shadowed her hand. Now her strokes carried a confidence shaped not by applause or criticism, but by the quiet certainty that creation itself was a language she could no longer live without. She rose each morning with a strange calm, preparing her palette with a focus that bordered on ritual. Her work table, once cluttered with discarded sketches and half-finished ideas, had become a space of order, her pigments arranged with care, her brushes cleaned and lined as though standing at attention for ceremony. Her subjects shifted as well. While she continued to sketch women and children from her neighborhood, she found herself increasingly drawn to the stillness of everyday objects, bowls of fruit, folded linens, a vase of wildflowers picked from the edges of Montmartre. These simple forms offered her a new way of seeing, a chance to explore light and shadow without the distraction of human complexity. She painted the curve of a pear as though it held a heartbeat, the fold of a cloth as though it contained a whispered secret. In these quiet studies, she discovered a depth she had not expected. It was as if each object, touched by her attention, revealed something of her own inner landscape. The still lifes reflected the balance she was trying to cultivate within herself, serenity shaped by discipline, clarity emerging from quiet observation. Her newfound calm did not mean the world around her softened. The critics remained skeptical. Some continued to dismiss her work as amateurish. Others accused her of lacking delicacy. A few, grudgingly, began to acknowledge her persistence, if not her talent. But Suzanne no longer felt wounded by their words. She had begun to see criticism as an external noise, a sound that might intrude upon her thoughts, but could no longer shape her sense of self. She understood now that art was not a performance for approval, but a dialogue between the painter and the truth she sought to reveal. And truth, she believed, could not be shaped by the opinions of those who expected her to paint the world through their eyes. One evening, after a long day at her easel, she stepped back to observe a new still life she had nearly completed. A bowl of apples resting beside a folded cloth, the scene illuminated by the waning light of late afternoon. The composition was simple, yet the mood held a quiet gravity. She realized that, without intending to, she had infused the objects with her own sense of rebuilding, as if the fruit, full and round, symbolized the nourishment she was finally offering her inner life, and the folded cloth represented the gentleness she was learning to extend to herself. She stood there for a long moment, struck not by pride but by recognition. This painting, unlike those born from turmoil, had emerged from a place of stillness, and in it she felt the pulse of something new. But even as her creative bloom took hold, the shadows of her past lingered at the edges. She occasionally encountered old lovers in the cafes of Montmartre, their faces carrying the faint surprise of seeing her again after her long absence. Some greeted her warmly, others with thin smiles that hinted at unresolved tension. Suzanne met each encounter with calm, neither seeking reconciliation nor harboring resentment. She had learned that people often remained rooted in their own narratives, unable to see beyond the roles they had once assigned. Her return to the public spaces of Montmartre was quiet, measured, as though she were stepping back into the world with a different rhythm. The stillness she cultivated also shifted her interactions with Maurice. Her son, now older and more observant, sensed the change within her. He watched her paint with a steadiness that had not existed in the tumultuous months before. On some evenings, he sat nearby as she worked, his silence comfortable rather than uncertain. They spoke little, but she felt a subtle easing of the tension that had once hovered between them. She understood that their bond had been tested repeatedly, not by lack of love, but by the harsh demands of survival. She hoped that this new calm in her demeanor would offer him the stability he had longed for, yet she also knew that their relationship would continue to shift, shaped by his own growing identity and her evolving aspirations. One afternoon, while she was cleaning her brushes, a neighbor stopped by with a small bouquet of wildflowers. "I see you at your window often," the woman said, smiling shyly. "You seem lighter." Suzanne accepted the flowers with gratitude. She had not realized that her inner shift was visible to others. The bouquet, simple and delicate, seemed to capture the essence of her new phase. She placed the flowers in a glass jar and set them on the windowsill, the sunlight catching the edges of the petals. They became the subject of several sketches over the next days, their gentle presence symbolizing the quiet renewal she felt blooming within her. Yet beneath this blossoming, a subtle tension remained. She felt a tug toward larger, more ambitious works, a pull she had not yet fully embraced. Her still lifes had given her clarity, but she sensed they were only the beginning of something deeper. The quiet aftermath had prepared the soil. The new bloom hinted at the potential for a more expansive, creative horizon. She felt this urge most strongly in the late evenings, when the world outside dimmed and her mind drifted toward unpainted visions, scenes of figures intertwined with emotion, landscapes carrying the weight of memory, portraits that revealed more than they concealed. As twilight settled one evening, she returned to the jar of cloudy turpentine. The liquid swirled faintly, reflecting the room in distorted hues. Suzanne dipped her brush once more into the jar, watching the colors dissipate like the remnants of an older version of herself dissolving into something clearer. She felt a quiet anticipation rising, not the frenetic urgency of her youth, but a steady, rooted confidence. She sensed that she stood at the threshold of another transformation, that the stillness she had cultivated would soon give way to a new expression of boldness. For now, she allowed the moment to linger, savoring the gentle hum of renewal. The jar of turpentine shimmered beneath the flickering lamplight, holding within its cloudy depths a reflection that felt both familiar and unknown. Suzanne stared into it, sensing the next phase of her life approaching with the soft inevitability of a tide. The rain tapping against Suzanne's studio window arrived first as a gentle murmur, then slowly gathered strength, as if the sky itself were attempting to speak in a language she had not yet learned. She paused in the middle of mixing her pigments, the muted colors on her palette reflecting the shifting grays outside. The drops hit the glass in uneven rhythms, soft at first, then insistent, then softened again, an irregular cadence that reminded her of the unpredictable patterns her life had taken. Each fall of rain seemed to echo with quiet insistence, reminding her that the serenity she had cultivated was only one layer of a much deeper landscape. Beneath the calm of her recent creative bloom lay the hidden costs of her choices, the emotional toll that had accumulated over years of striving, and the heavy, unspoken questions that lingered like shadows beneath the surface of her work. She sensed that the rain marked the beginning of another inward descent, not a collapse, but a reckoning with truths she had long set aside. For weeks, she had felt a subtle tension gathering within her, a fatigue that seemed to settle into her bones despite her peaceful routine. She worked with care, painted with focus, and maintained the calm she had long sought. Yet a faint ache pulsed beneath these quiet days, an ache that had no name but demanded her attention nonetheless. Her body, once accustomed to long hours posing for artists, now protested against the strain of her intensified work. Her joints ached after sitting too long. Her back stiffened when she bent over her canvas. Her eyes burned after evenings spent under the dim glow of her lamp. She was not old, but she was no longer young, and the years of emotional upheaval had carved their weight into her. The rain outside seemed to mirror this heaviness, as though the sky too felt the burden of its own accumulated storms. Yet it was not physical exhaustion alone that unsettled her. The deeper cost lay in the quiet solitude she had chosen, necessary for her art, but isolating nonetheless. She had distanced herself from the chaotic gatherings of Montmartre, from the acquaintances who once filled her days with laughter and occasionally with turmoil. Though she did not miss the gossip or the drunken quarrels, she sometimes felt the ache of absence, a sense of detachment from the world she had once inhabited with reckless energy. She wondered whether her newfound stillness had come at the price of connection. And in the long evenings, when the streets below her studio darkened and the city's voices faded, she felt the weight of loneliness settle upon her like an unwelcome visitor. She thought often of Maurice during these quieter days. He was growing into a young man with a temperament both sensitive and unpredictable. She observed him from a distance, studying the way he carried his emotional burdens with a grace that reminded her painfully of herself. He was perceptive, often too perceptive, absorbing the atmosphere of their small home without needing explanations. When he watched her paint, She felt him seeing not only the images she crafted, but the unspoken fatigue behind them. He did not mention it, but she sensed that he worried. Their relationship, though steadier than before, was still marked by moments of silence that neither quite knew how to bridge. She longed to speak openly with him, to confess her fears and uncertainties, but a strange restraint always stopped her. She feared placing her emotional weight upon his shoulders. She feared revealing how fragile she sometimes felt. The rain intensified, streaking the glass in long lines that distorted the view outside. Passers-by hurried under umbrellas. Carriages rattled through the puddles. The world rushed on with its usual indifference. Suzanne watched through the window, feeling the distance between herself and the life unfolding beyond her walls. It was an odd sensation, to be present in the world yet slightly removed from it, as though she had stepped into a quieter chamber of existence. She wondered whether other artists experienced this sensation, whether solitude was an inevitable cost of creation, or whether she had imposed it upon herself too readily. Still, within this solitude, she worked. Her latest series of still lifes had gained a subtle complexity. Her strokes carried a new depth of tone, a richness that spoke not of outward turbulence, but of inward contemplation. She painted not merely what she saw, but what she felt. Subdued colors edged with quiet sorrow, forms that suggested resilience, obscured by weariness. Her canvases revealed truths she had not intended to express, truths she recognized only upon stepping back. She saw in them the reflection of her own emotional landscape, a blend of strength and strain, clarity and exhaustion. The realization left her breathless, as though her art had spoken before she found the words. One evening, as she rinsed her brushes and the rain lightened to a soft drizzle, she felt a sudden wave of fatigue sweep through her. It was not the tiredness of a long day, but something deeper, a heaviness that settled into her chest like a slow, deliberate weight. She sat down, pressing a hand to her heart, listening to its unsteady rhythm. The room blurred slightly around her. She closed her eyes and breathed slowly until the feeling passed. When she opened them again, she found herself staring at the half-finished painting before her. It depicted a small wooden table bathed in muted light, a single pear resting on a folded cloth. The simplicity of the scene struck her with new intensity. How strange, she thought, that even the most modest subject could carry the weight of one's entire emotional world. She reached for her brush, but hesitated. Something within her whispered that she should rest, that she should acknowledge the toll the past year had taken upon her. But she was not accustomed to listening to such gentle warnings. She had survived by pushing through hardship, by refusing to yield to exhaustion. Yet at this moment she sensed that ignoring her body's plea might carry consequences she could not afford. Reluctantly, she set the brush down. In the quiet that followed, she found herself reflecting on the years that had brought her here. The hunger, the heartbreaks, the triumphs, the betrayals, the relentless push to prove herself in a world that questioned her at every turn. She wondered whether she had ever truly paused long enough to grieve the hardships she endured. Perhaps that was the cost of survival. One moved forward so quickly that the pain remained unprocessed, lingering in the crevices of the heart. She leaned back, closing her eyes again. The rain had softened to a faint whisper, barely audible through the thickened air. She sensed that this period of her life, marked by stillness, introspection, and quiet labor, was preparing her for another shift. Something within her was gathering, as if her heart, weary though it was, recognized the need to deepen its roots before the next storm. She did not know what form that storm would take, only that life rarely allowed moments of peace to endure unchanged. Opening her eyes, she looked once more at the painting. The pear seemed to glow faintly in the lamplight, its form infused with a tenderness she had not intended. She rose slowly, touching the edge of the canvas as though acknowledging a silent companion. The room felt both intimate and vast, filled with the soft murmur of unresolved emotions. Suzanne exhaled, long and slow, sensing that the coming days would demand more of her than she had yet given, and beyond the window, the rain began once more, light at first, then heavier, as though echoing the quiet toll that weighed upon her spirit. The candle had burned low by the time Suzanne realized how deeply the room had fallen into silence, the flame shrinking into a trembling bead of light that fought to hold back the approaching dark. The scent of wax mingled with the faint perfume of dust and linseed oil, and in that quiet dimness, she felt an unfamiliar stillness drift through her, a stillness not of peace, but of awareness. Something in her life had begun to shift again, slowly, gently, like a door creaking open somewhere far down an unseen corridor. She sensed it during the small hours of the night, when the city outside softened into whispers and only the deepest of worries found room to speak. For in this period, friendships that had once shaped her world began to fall away like autumn leaves, while unexpected new ones floated into her orbit, subtle in their arrival, yet profound in their impact. The shifting of her circle did not occur through sudden betrayal or dramatic endings, but through the natural drifting of lives that had once intertwined too tightly and now gently loosened their hold. The first friendship to fade was with a woman she had once trusted completely, a fellow model whose laughter had once filled Suzanne's early years in Montmartre with warmth. They had shared secrets, debts, ruined meals, and moments of fierce loyalty during seasons of hardship. But as Suzanne devoted herself more intensely to painting, their paths diverged. Her friend remained rooted in the lively chaos of Montmartre's cafes and dance halls, still seeking the kind of excitement Suzanne had outgrown. When they met one afternoon, the conversation felt strangely disjointed, like two melodies played in different keys. Her friend spoke eagerly of rumors, of lovers' quarrels, of the newest singer at the cabaret. Suzanne listened with affection but also with quiet distance, realizing she no longer felt nourished by the life her friend described. She needed something else now. Quieter connections, deeper conversations, companionship that reflected the subtle transformations within her. They parted warmly that day, but Suzanne sensed it was the last time their lives would truly converge. Another friendship dissolved under the strain of unspoken jealousy. A young painter she had once supported began to see her progress as an unspoken threat, though she had never attempted to compete with him. He grew distant, then curt, then dismissive, as though removing himself from her orbit could soften the sting of witnessing her growth. Suzanne grieved this loss quietly, knowing how rare it was to find genuine camaraderie in artistic circles where envy crept like a shadow beneath every brushstroke. Yet she did not chase him. She had learned, slowly and painfully, that not all departures required pursuit. Some exits allowed space for new relationships to enter. Indeed, it was in this shifting landscape that she encountered new companions who would offer her a different kind of nourishment. One of them was an older woman who lived on the floor below, a seamstress with gentle eyes and a voice that rarely rose above a whisper. They met by chance on the staircase, each carrying burdens of their own. Over time, they developed a quiet bond marked not by shared histories, but by mutual understanding. The seamstress would bring her small offerings of comfort, a piece of cloth with a beautiful pattern, a warm cup of tea on especially cold days, a soft word when Suzanne's fatigue was visible. Suzanne, in turn, offered her moments of companionship without expectation, allowing herself to rest in the presence of someone who asked nothing of her ambition. Another unexpected friendship grew with a young sculptor who rented a small workspace nearby. He was gentle, unassuming, and deeply observant. He admired Suzanne's work without the tangled emotions that so often accompanied admiration from men. He spoke of texture, form, and light with the same reverence she felt for line and color. Their conversations drifted naturally, from art to philosophy, from memory to dreams. It was a connection that brought her a sense of quiet belonging, reminding her that growth did not require isolation. It required the right company. Yet even here, she kept a careful distance, protecting the tender core of her renewed stability. During this time, she also noticed how the world she had once known was gradually fading. The old cafes where she had shared laughter with friends now echoed with new voices. Familiar faces moved away or changed or became consumed by their own struggles. Even the artistic landscape of Montmartre began to shift. The painters who once dominated its studios were expanding their horizons or retreating into obscurity. New movements were taking root, reflecting the restless pulse of Paris in transition. Suzanne observed these changes with a kind of bittersweet acceptance. She understood that life moved in cycles, that chapters opened and closed without seeking permission, and as the streets around her changed, so too did her sense of belonging. She no longer felt tethered to the bohemian chaos that had once ignited her youth. She stood instead at the threshold of something quieter, more grounded, though she did not yet know where it would lead. Yet even as these outer shifts unfolded, inner questions stirred. On certain nights, when fatigue pressed heavily on her, she wondered whether she had given too much of herself to art, whether the sacrifices she made, including the slow drifting of friendships, were necessary or merely the consequence of her restless nature. She wondered whether she had lost certain people because she had failed them or because they had never truly understood her. These reflections surfaced, especially in conversations with the seamstress, who seemed to sense the unspoken weight Suzanne carried. One evening, as they shared a simple stew in Suzanne's small kitchen, the seamstress remarked softly, "Some friendships are not meant to last forever. They belong to the season in which they arrive." Suzanne nodded, feeling both relieved and pierced by the truth of the words. With each passing week, she grew more aware of the subtle lines between loneliness and solitude. Loneliness carried an ache, a longing for something absent. Solitude carried a different quality, one of stillness, of reverence, of listening. She found herself walking along the quieter paths of Montmartre, seeking moments of solitude that did not feel empty but nourishing. She stood on the hill at dusk, watching the lights of Paris flicker into existence, feeling the contours of her life shifting with the changing city. She sensed that something within her was preparing for another transformation, though she did not yet know its shape. Back in her studio, the candle flickered again, casting small halos of light across the walls. Suzanne placed a hand gently on the table, feeling the faint warmth of the wood beneath her skin. She thought of the friendships she had lost, of those she had gained, of the evolving tapestry of her life. She knew that each connection, whether fleeting or enduring, had woven itself into her identity. And though some threads had unraveled, others waited quietly, ready to be discovered. The flame trembled once more, shrinking into a delicate glimmer before surrendering to the darkness. Suzanne rose slowly and crossed the room to place her hand against the cool window pane. Outside, the night stretched across Montmartre, quiet and endless, holding within it 1,000 stories she would one day come to understand. The gentle creak of the studio floorboards broke the stillness, like a soft sigh released from the bones of the old room, stirring the dust motes drifting in the pale afternoon light. Suzanne paused mid-stroke, her brush hovering inches above the canvas as she tilted her head toward the sound. It was an ordinary creak, nothing more than the house shifting beneath her feet, yet it sent a faint tremor through her, as if some unseen presence had stepped across the threshold of her thoughts. With age, she had grown more sensitive to such subtleties, the rustle of curtains in a draft, the distant murmur of footsteps on the stair, the shift of wood expanding in the changing temperature. These small, almost imperceptible sensations formed the quiet backdrop of her days, marking the passage of time with a tenderness she had once been too restless to notice. In this slowing rhythm, the late years of her life began to unfold, quietly at first, then with a steady insistence that she could not ignore. She was no longer the young woman who once raced through the streets of Montmartre with charcoal-stained fingers and wild ambition. The mirror revealed changes she did not always recognize: the softening of her jawline, the faint creases beside her eyes, the tiredness that lingered even after nights of uninterrupted sleep. These signs of aging crept into her awareness gradually, like the fading of a familiar melody. She felt them in her joints when she climbed the steep steps to her studio, in the heaviness of her arms after long hours of painting, in the subtle trembling of her fingers when she held her brushes too tightly. Yet she refused to let these changes dictate her pace. If anything, they deepened her commitment to her work, infusing her art with a new emotional weight she had not possessed in her youth. But with the passing years came a new kind of vulnerability. She could no longer ignore the precariousness of her circumstances, the uncertainty of income, the fragility of her health, the unpredictability of an artistic world always in flux. Montmartre itself had begun to transform. The cafes that once pulsed with youthful energy now hosted a different crowd, one more refined, less chaotic. Many of the artists she had known were gone. Some moved to new cities, others swallowed by disappointment, a few taken too soon by illness or despair. The bohemian fever of her youth had cooled into something quieter, more restrained. Suzanne felt the shift acutely, sensing that the era which had shaped her was fading, like the embers of a dying fire. In these changing times, she sometimes felt like a relic, neither celebrated nor forgotten, lingering in a space between recognition and obscurity. Younger artists passed her in the streets with polite nods, aware of her name but unsure of her legacy. Some approached her with admiration, seeking guidance. Others regarded her with cautious curiosity, unsure how to interpret a woman who had defied so many conventions. Suzanne received their attention with grace, though she often felt a quiet sorrow beneath the surface. She had fought so hard to claim a place in the world of art, yet the world continued to shift beneath her feet, threatening to erase the path she had carved. Her relationship with Maurice reflected this complex tension. He had grown into a talented painter in his own right, possessing a fierce sensitivity and a flair for emotional intensity. His successes brought her immense pride, yet also a subtle ache. She saw in his work the echoes of her own struggles, the shadows of the hardships they had endured together. They were bound by love, but also by wounds neither of them could fully articulate. He cared for her deeply, yet their bond often trembled beneath the weight of their shared history. There were days when he visited her with warmth, eager to discuss art or share a new piece he had completed. But there were also days when he arrived pale and defensive, burdened by his own battles, with alcohol, with self-doubt, with the ghosts of their past. Suzanne longed to ease his suffering, yet she knew that some storms must be weathered alone. As her world contracted into the small radius of her studio and the familiar streets surrounding it, Suzanne found herself slipping into a rhythm of introspection. She spent long hours reflecting on her earlier years, on the choices she had made, the risks she had taken, the people who had drifted in and out of her life. She remembered the thrill of posing for Renoir, the quiet intensity of her conversations with Degas, the passionate entanglements that had left her breathless and bruised. She thought of the nights she had gone hungry so Maurice could eat, the cramped rooms where she had sketched by candlelight, the countless small triumphs that had sustained her. In these memories, she found both solace and sorrow, a sense of gratitude for the fullness of her life, tempered by regret for the moments she had lost to fear, anger, or exhaustion. There were days when she felt lonely, the kind of loneliness that seeped into her bones rather than her heart. It was not the loneliness of lacking company, for she had acquaintances, neighbors, even occasional visitors who admired her work. Instead, it was the loneliness of feeling suspended between worlds, between youth and old age, between recognition and obscurity, between the fire of creation and the slow dimming of physical strength. She wondered whether other women of her age felt this same limbo, this quiet displacement as the world continued its march forward. Yet this sense of displacement also brought unexpected gifts. With fewer distractions, she discovered a deeper clarity in her artistic vision. She explored new themes, experimenting with bolder colors and more abstract forms. Her late works carried a gravity that surprised even her, a rawness born not of rebellion, but of experience. She no longer painted to prove herself. She painted because it was the truest expression of her existence, the language that had carried her through decades of turmoil and transformation. Each stroke of her brush felt like a quiet assertion. I am here. I have lived. I will not disappear unnoticed. One afternoon, as she adjusted her easel to catch the fading light, she was struck by an unexpected realization. She wondered whether her legacy would ever be fully understood, whether the world would remember her not simply as a muse or a scandalous figure, but as an artist who had carved her truth into canvas despite every obstacle. She did not crave fame, but she yearned for honesty, an honest remembrance, an honest recognition of her struggles and her strength. The thought lingered, fragile yet persistent, as she dipped her brush into the muted palette before her. The studio floor creaked again, responding to her subtle shift in weight. Suzanne stepped back, studying the painting she had labored over for days. The colors shimmered softly beneath the low light, revealing a depth of emotion she had not consciously placed there. She felt a flicker of warmth in her chest, a quiet reassurance that, even in her late years, her art continued to speak with a voice that was distinctly, fiercely her own. Outside, the soft murmur of evening began to seep into the streets of Montmartre, carrying with it the distant sounds of footsteps, conversations, and the faint toll of a church bell. Suzanne placed her brush down gently, acknowledging the day's end with a small nod to herself. She felt poised between the life she had lived and the life she still hoped to create, standing in the doorway of a time both tender and uncertain. And beneath her feet the floorboards whispered once more, their soft creak guiding her deeper into the quiet twilight of her unfolding years. The old newspaper that blew across the doorway that morning carried with it the unmistakable scent of change, a dry flutter of thin paper skimming the floorboards before settling at Suzanne's feet, as though delivering a message from a world that continued to evolve without her permission. She bent slowly to pick it up, her joints protesting the motion, and as she lifted the crumpled sheet, she noticed how the headlines spoke of a Paris reshaped by forces she had watched gather for years. The world beyond Montmartre was shifting, politically, socially, artistically, and she felt those distant tremors echoing through the quiet chambers of her own life. For while she continued to paint with unwavering devotion, she knew that age had ushered her into a territory she had never fully imagined, a place where the world changed faster than one could keep pace, where movements arose in the salons and cafes that she no longer visited, where younger artists forged paths that bore little resemblance to the one she had carved. Yet amid these transformations, she sensed with unexpected clarity the deep truth that the world could change all it wished. She would remain steadfast in her own vision. As she set the newspaper aside, she approached the window and watched the city shift beneath the morning light. Men hurried with briefcases tucked under their arms. Women carried baskets filled with bread still warm from the oven. Children ran in uneven bursts of laughter along the narrow street. It all seemed ordinary enough, yet Suzanne felt an undercurrent of strangeness, an unfamiliar rhythm threading itself through the familiar scenes. Paris was growing more structured, more modern, less wild than the Montmartre of her youth. Gone were the days when the hill pulsed with the reckless energy of penniless painters and fearless models. The old cafes, once crowded with artists exchanging ideas, late into the night had either closed or reinvented themselves for a more refined clientele. Even the studios, once the beating heart of the district, had begun to quiet as younger painters drifted toward new artistic neighborhoods or embraced movements that diverged sharply from the traditions she had once known. She felt these changes with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. On the one hand, she mourned the loss of the bohemian world that had shaped her identity, a world where art was born not from theory, but from the raw urgency of survival. On the other hand, she recognized that change was the lifeblood of creation. She admired the bold spirits of the younger generation, even if she did not always understand their philosophies. Some of these young artists spoke of dismantling the very structures that had once confined her, rejecting the constraints of realism and narrative, embracing abstraction and experimentation in ways that both intrigued and unsettled her. Their canvases often seemed like storms of color and emotion, breaking from recognizable form. Suzanne observed their work with the discerning eye of someone who had forged her own path against convention. She knew that every generation needed to rebel, and she could hardly fault them for their boldness, for she had once done the same. Yet despite her openness to these new forms, she remained anchored in her own truth. She painted what she felt rather than what movements dictated. She trusted her instincts, her memories, and the slow accumulation of insight that came from decades of observing life without adornment. This fidelity to her own vision was not born from stubbornness, but from authenticity. She'd never sought to follow trends, nor did she seek now to escape them. She simply painted because painting was the one place where her inner world found its voice. Still, the changes around her stirred deeper reflections. She found herself contemplating the nature of artistic legacy, not in the grand public sense of the word, but in the quiet, personal way that most artists measure their worth. Would her works endure? Would they speak to others long after her hands grew still? She knew that history was fickle, that praise could dissolve as quickly as condemnation, that the art world had a habit of rediscovering and forgetting artists in cycles no one could predict. She wondered if her name would survive the coming decades, or if she would be remembered solely in relation to the men who had painted her in her youth. The thought lingered in her chest like a quiet ache, though not one sharp enough to dampen her resolve. Her reflections deepened when she considered the larger forces reshaping France itself. The aftermath of political turmoil and the rising currents of modernism infused the cultural atmosphere with urgency and uncertainty. Conversations in the streets spoke of changing roles, shifting values, the evolving place of women in society. Suzanne felt these discussions keenly, for she had lived her entire life in defiance of expectations imposed upon her gender and class. She had raised a child alone, pursued an artistic career with relentless determination, and refused to be boxed into the narrow definitions society imposed upon women of her time. Now, as she observed younger women stepping into roles she herself had fought to claim, she felt a strange mixture of satisfaction and wonder. Perhaps her own existence had been a small fracture in the wall that once barred their way. Her thoughts drifted toward her own work, particularly the paintings she had recently begun exploring, pieces that delved into themes of aging, memory, and the quiet interiors of domestic life. These subjects spoke to her in ways that more dramatic scenes no longer could. She found herself drawn to the subtleties of stillness, to the quiet dignity of wrinkles, to the soft, unspoken moments shared between individuals whose lives were bound by routine rather than passion. She painted with a tenderness shaped not by weakness, but by the maturity of someone who had lived too much to romanticize life's harshness. Her later works, rich in color and depth, were not meant to dazzle the viewer, but to invite them into a space of contemplation, a space where the world's changes receded, leaving only the intimate conversation between painter and canvas. One afternoon, as she adjusted her brushes and prepared to resume a portrait she had been working on, she noticed something subtle yet profound. Her hand trembled slightly, Not from fatigue, but from the awareness that she was capturing something rare, something that resonated with the quiet truths of her late years. The portrait depicted an elderly woman seated by a window, her posture relaxed, her gaze distant but gentle. Suzanne recognized herself in the figure, not in appearance but in essence. The woman's quiet resolve, her enduring presence, the stoic acceptance etched into her features reflected Suzanne's own journey. She smiled softly, touched by the realization that even as the world around her raced forward, she had found a way to anchor herself in the timeless rhythm of human experience. Outside, the newspaper that had blown across her doorway earlier now rested flat against the floor, its edges fluttering slightly in the breeze that seeped through the cracks. The doorway itself seemed to beckon her forward, inviting her to step beyond the edges of her studio and confront the next unfolding chapter of her life. Suzanne paused, gazing at that threshold with a thoughtful expression. She sensed that the world was calling her to reconcile what she had been with what she was becoming, to acknowledge that even in her late years, transformation remained possible. With a steady hand, she turned back to her canvas. The world could change, could shift beneath her feet, could alter the shape of Montmartre and rewrite the rules of art. But in this room, beneath this quiet light, her truth remained unwavering. For now, she lifted her brush once more, breathing in the familiar scent of paint and possibility, preparing to meet the changing world through the steady, enduring language of her own creation. The footsteps that faded down the staircase that day lingered in Suzanne's mind long after the sound itself dissolved into the hum of the building, as though the departing steps carried with them a chapter of her life, whose final page had just been turned. She stood motionless for a moment, brush in hand, listening to the echo fade into the quiet below. It was André Uter who had left, the man who had once filled her days with youthful passion and restless energy, whose laughter had once rung through her studio with a warmth that softened even her hardest moods. Their relationship, once so vivid and consuming, had dimmed with time. Reduced to a weary companionship punctuated by disagreements, neither of them had the strength to mend. As his steps faded into the silence, Suzanne felt no relief nor despair, only a gentle, inevitable sorrow, as if acknowledging that something which had long been fraying had finally come undone. In the years since their first meeting, André had brought brightness into her life at a time when she had nearly forgotten the sensation of being adored. Their early years together had been filled with fire. Long walks through Montmartre, wild arguments followed by fervent reconciliations, creative experiments shared across canvases, and nights that blurred into dawn. He admired her with a fervor that bordered on reverence, and she, in turn, found in him a vitality that made her feel unexpectedly young again. But passion, she knew, was fickle. It burned brightly, then cooled into something quieter, something more fragile. Over time, their differences became more pronounced. Her need for solitude clashed with his hunger for stimulation. Her artistic discipline clashed with his impulsive nature. Yet they lingered in each other's lives for years, tethered by affection, habit, and a shared history that neither wished to sever until the thread finally grew too thin to hold. With André's departure, her studio felt larger, emptier, as though the air itself had widened around her. She turned slowly, her gaze drifting across the familiar objects, the easel, the paint-stained table, the collection of brushes worn from decades of use. These things had always been her anchors, yet today they seemed to carry a different weight. She felt the quiet settling in her bones, a sense that her world was becoming narrower, more intimate, shaped less by relationships and more by the quiet, unwavering presence of her work. She had lost lovers before, had parted ways with friends, had watched entire chapters of her life dissolve like mist. But this parting struck her differently, not because of heartbreak, but because it reminded her of the relentless passage of time. She was no longer the fiery woman who had captivated André. She had grown into someone steadier, wiser, more introspective, and also more aware of her own solitude. Her thoughts drifted inevitably to Maurice. Their relationship had become a delicate dance of affection and distance, shaped by their shared past and complicated by the realities of adulthood. Maurice had grown into a painter of remarkable talent, his emotional intensity carved into every one of his works. Critics admired his boldness, collectors sought his canvases with growing enthusiasm, yet beneath his success lay currents of instability, periods of drinking, bouts of doubt, moments when his emotions overwhelmed him in ways that frightened Suzanne. She saw in him the same fire that had driven her in her youth, but his flame burned more erratically, more dangerously. She worried for him constantly, yet felt powerless to intervene fully. Their bond, though tender, was often shadowed by unspoken tension. He loved her deeply, perhaps too deeply, and in ways that sometimes felt entangled with old wounds neither had fully healed. The footsteps of his departures echoed in her memory as well. Moments when he stormed out after a disagreement, or slipped away quietly when her emotional distance pressed too heavily upon him. Yet no matter how far he wandered, he always returned, carrying with him both the pride of accomplishment and the burden of his internal battles. Suzanne longed to offer him comfort, but she understood that her own complexities had shaped his, that the fierce independence which sustained her had also created spaces he struggled to fill. Their relationship was a tapestry woven of love, regret, admiration, and unresolved longing, the kind of bond that grew only more intricate with age. As she stood in her studio after André's departure, Suzanne felt these interwoven relationships pressing upon her. The lovers who had come and gone, the son who remained both near and distant, the friends who had faded into memory, the acquaintances whose names she could barely recall. She realized that her life had become a landscape shaped by arrivals and departures, each leaving behind a trace that clung to her, like the faint scent of turpentine lingering in the air. And yet, through all these shifting connections, one presence had remained constant: her art. It was the one companion that had never abandoned her, never shifted its loyalty, never demanded anything other than honesty. She sat before her canvas, letting the silence settle like dust around her. The painting she had been working on, a portrait of a woman seated in quiet reflection, seemed to mirror her own state of mind. The figure on the canvas gazed downward, her posture relaxed, but heavy with thought. Suzanne studied the image for a long moment, feeling an uncanny kinship with the painted woman. Perhaps she had always painted herself, she thought, even when she tried not to. Every canvas revealed a facet of her inner world, a fragment of her experience captured in color and form. Her thoughts drifted suddenly to the earlier years, to the laughter that once filled the studio, to the warmth of André's presence, to the complicated tenderness between herself and Maurice. She felt these memories settling around her like the dust motes swirling in the afternoon light, comforting, yet tinged with melancholy. The world had grown quieter, but not empty. She understood now that these late years required a different kind of courage, a willingness to continue creating even as the familiar voices faded, a willingness to face solitude without bitterness, a willingness to accept that life's intensity did not diminish simply because its pace slowed. She dipped her brush into the paint, her hand steady despite the heaviness in her chest. As she worked, the studio around her filled once more with the soft sounds of creation, the whisper of bristles on canvas, the faint clink of glass jars, the soft sigh of her breath as she concentrated. She felt herself returning, in small but certain ways, to the essence of who she was. Even as relationships shifted, even as youth slipped further from her grasp, her purpose remained unshaken. As she painted, she sensed the faint echo of André's departing footsteps still lingering on the staircase, but now the sound no longer pained her. Instead, it reminded her of all the chapters she had lived, all the loves she had known, all the transformations she had endured. Life moved forward with or without her permission, and she, resilient, tempered by experience, anchored by her craft, would continue to move with it, one quiet step at a time. And beneath her brush, the painted woman's gaze softened, as though acknowledging the gentle truth Suzanne could no longer deny, that even the most significant departures carried within them the possibility of new beginnings. The scent of oil paint lingered in the air long after Suzanne stepped away from her easel, drifting through the dim room like the last trace of perfume left behind by a passing visitor. It was a fragrance she knew intimately, one that had accompanied her through every transformation of her life, through poverty, ambition, heartbreak, resilience, and now into the quiet twilight of her later years. As she walked slowly toward the window, the evening light stretched itself across the floor in long golden ribbons, illuminating the dust motes that spun in gentle spirals. Her joints ached with a familiar insistence, and she felt the slight tremble of age in her fingers, yet this weakness did not trouble her. It was simply part of the inward shift she had begun to accept, a soft surrender to time, not as an enemy, but as a companion who had traveled beside her far longer than any lover or friend. She paused beside a recently finished canvas, its colors still fresh, the faint scent of linseed oil rising from the surface. It depicted a quiet domestic scene, a woman seated alone near a window, her posture relaxed, her expression contemplative, her hands folded in her lap. Suzanne had painted it in slow, thoughtful strokes, allowing each layer of color to settle before adding the next. This painting felt different from her earlier works, not bolder or more ambitious, but deeper, more inward. It carried a stillness that spoke to her in a way she could not fully articulate. She often found herself returning to it, studying the gentle slant of the woman's shoulders, the way the light touched the folds of her dress. There was something of herself in the painting, though she had not intended to create a self-portrait. It was a mirror of mood rather than appearance, a subtle echo of the twilight settling within her. Her late years were filled with this kind of gentle intensity. She no longer painted with the fiery urgency of her youth, nor with the emotional tumult that had defined her middle years. Instead, she painted with a quiet reverence, as though each stroke were an act of gratitude. She understood now that creation was not a race toward recognition, but a conversation with the self, a slow unraveling of truth through color and form. Perhaps this was why her final paintings carried such serenity. They were shaped not by the need to prove, but by the desire to understand. They emerged from a soul that had weathered storms and now found solace in the soft rhythms of daily life. Visitors who came to her studio noticed the shift in her demeanor. They often remarked that she seemed calmer, more introspective, though still very much herself. There remained in her gaze a spark of the fierce independence that had carried her through decades of hardship, but it was now softened by wisdom rather than sharpened by defiance. Some guests found her quiet intensity unsettling, as though she saw more than she revealed. Others found comfort in her presence, sensing that they were in the company of someone who had lived fully, who had loved, suffered, fought, and created, without ever losing her core. Suzanne did not concern herself with their impressions. She had learned long ago that people saw what they wished, projecting their own fears and desires onto her as easily as painters once projected their visions onto her body when she was a muse. What she cherished most in these twilight years was the space between moments, the silence between strokes of her brush, the pause before a visitor spoke, the faint exhale the room seemed to release just after she extinguished her lamp. These small pockets of stillness held a tenderness she had overlooked in her earlier years. She recalled the frantic pace of her youth, when each day felt like a battle for survival or recognition, when the world seemed determined to push her into roles she refused to accept. how far she had traveled from that time. Now she understood that life was not defined by the moments of triumph or tragedy, but by the quiet shifts that occurred in between. Yet her solitude was not without its shadows. There were nights when she lay awake, listening to the distant hum of Montmartre, and felt the weight of memories pressing gently upon her. She thought of the lovers who had come and gone, their faces blurred by time but their emotional imprints still intact. She thought of the friendships that had dissolved like fading melodies, leaving behind the echo of laughter and the sting of partings. She thought of the struggles she had endured, the criticism she had absorbed, the uncertainties she had faced as a woman daring to carve her own path in a world that preferred her, silent and still. And she thought of Maurice, her son, her muse, her greatest source of pride and pain. Their relationship remained a delicate balance even now, shaped by years of unspoken tenderness and tension. He visited her often, sometimes brimming with artistic fervor, other times shadowed by his internal storms. She recognized in him the same mixture of brilliance and vulnerability that had shaped her own life, but she also feared for him, aware that the intensity that fueled his creativity also carried the potential for destruction. Despite these concerns, she cherished their moments together. When he entered her studio, she felt the room change slightly, warming with his presence. They spoke in quiet tones about their work, sharing insights and techniques. Sometimes he sat silently beside her as she painted, his gaze filled with a mixture of admiration and sorrow that she could not fully decipher. She longed to bridge the unspoken distance between them, yet she sensed that certain truths remained too fragile for words. Perhaps that was the nature of deep bonds, she thought. Not all feelings could be expressed. Some were meant to be understood through presence alone. Her reflections often drifted toward the nature of endings. She sensed, in a way that only those who have lived long and fought hard can sense, that her life was entering its final stretch. Not in a dramatic or sorrowful way, but in the gentle recognition that the body could no longer keep pace with the spirit indefinitely. She felt the days shorten, not with dread, but with acceptance, as though each one offered a small, glowing ember to be cherished before it cooled. She found herself writing letters she never sent, sorting through old sketches, rearranging her studio as though preparing it for someone else to enter after she had gone. These gestures were not acts of resignation, but of care. She wished to leave behind an order, a quiet clarity, a final testament to the life she had shaped with her own hands. One evening, after finishing a painting that seemed to carry the weight of all her years, she stood at the center of her studio, breathing in the scent of fresh oil paint. The light had dimmed to a soft gold, settling on the surfaces around her like a gentle blessing. She closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the moment, sensing that she had reached a place of profound stillness within herself. The scent of oil lingered, steady and familiar, a companion to her solitude. She opened her eyes as the room settled into dusk. The shadows stretched long across the floor, filling the corners with their quiet presence. The day had ended, but the night felt patient, as though waiting for her to take her next breath, her next step, her next small gesture. When she finally moved, it was with a slowness born not of weakness, but of reflection. She reached out and gently touched the edge of the latest canvas, her fingers brushing the surface as though offering a silent farewell to a moment she knew would never return in quite the same way. Outside, the twilight deepened, carrying with it the soft promise of both rest and remembrance. The studio door closed at dusk with a softness that did not startle her, a small wooden sigh that blended into the settling quiet of the evening. Suzanne paused where she stood, allowing the familiar hush to gather around her like a shawl laid gently across her shoulders. Outside the window, the day's final light thinned into muted gold, casting faint reflections along the glass panes and stretching across the floor in languid streaks. It was the hour when shadows lengthened, yet did not yet merge with darkness, an in-between time she had come to cherish deeply. These were the moments when memory rose unbidden, drifting through her thoughts with a tenderness that no longer brought pain, but carried instead the delicate fragrance of acceptance. Her body had grown slower in recent years, a truth she acknowledged without resentment. Each movement now required intention, each breath carried a subtle weight. She felt time in her bones the way she once felt the rhythm of a dance or the gaze of an artist capturing her form. There were mornings when rising from her bed demanded more patience than strength, and afternoons when the simple act of mixing pigments left her hands trembling slightly. Yet even as her physical energy waned, her inner world expanded with luminous clarity. She saw more than ever before, saw beyond appearances, beyond the noise of the past, into the quiet essence of things. It was as though age had softened the world's harshness, revealing the gentle contours beneath. On this quiet evening, she moved to her chair with deliberate care, lowering herself into its familiar embrace. A faint ache traveled along her spine, but she did not resist it. Pain had become a companion, not an enemy, a reminder of all she had lived, all she had survived. She reached for a folded blanket draped over the chair's arm and placed it across her lap, savoring its warmth. The room glowed in the last breath of twilight, and in that glow Suzanne felt her thoughts drift freely, brushing against the corners of her life she had not visited in some time. She thought of her childhood, of her mother's stern face softened by exhaustion, of the nights they spent in cramped rooms where the scent of damp clothes lingered long after the day's laundry had dried. She remembered the hunger that gnawed at her in those early years, not only the hunger for food, but the hunger for possibility, for escape, for a life that belonged to her alone. She recalled the young girl she had been, wandering the streets with restless steps, unaware that destiny was already circling her like a patient bird gliding on unseen winds. How strange, she thought, that the path toward becoming oneself begins long before one recognizes the direction. Her memories slipped gently into the years when she had first stood before the artists of Montmartre. Her body offered to their canvases long before her hands found their own tools. She saw again the faces of painters who studied her with varying mixtures of desire, admiration, or indifference, men who understood how to capture the contours of her body but rarely considered the landscape of her thoughts. She felt the echo of those hours spent holding still, her muscles burning, her mind wandering, her heart quietly yearning for a different kind of creation. She did not resent those years. They had shaped her, taught her discipline, introduced her to the vocabulary of art, but she no longer felt tethered to them. They were chapters she had read and written and closed. Her thoughts shifted toward the long arc of her artistic life, the battles fought, the works created, the risks taken. She saw again the brushes worn to stubs, the pigments rubbed into her fingertips, the canvases turned to the wall to conceal their raw vulnerability until she was ready to face them. She remembered the exhilaration of her first exhibitions, the sting of criticism sharp enough to make her hands tremble, the rare moments of praise that warmed her for days. She reflected on the quiet triumph of mastering a line, the subtle joy of balancing shadow and light, the rare peace she felt when a painting aligned perfectly with the vision in her mind. Age had not dimmed these joys. If anything, it had heightened them, allowing her to savor each moment with deeper gratitude. And then, inevitably, her thoughts turned to Maurice, her son, her mirror, her complication, her pride. In these twilight years, she thought of him more often than she admitted aloud. She imagined him painting in his own studio, surrounded by the same scent of turpentine that filled her own life. She wondered whether he found the same solace in creation, whether the brush gave him the steadiness that his emotions so often lacked. She knew he carried wounds, some inflicted by life, some by his own temperament, some perhaps unintentionally shaped by her choices. This truth had weighed upon her heart for years, Yet tonight it felt gentler, softened by time and understanding. She loved him fiercely still, loved him with the quiet ache of a mother who has seen her child struggle and falter and rise again. A faint breeze slipped through the window, carrying with it the scent of smoke from a distant chimney and the murmured footsteps of passers-by. Suzanne closed her eyes, allowing the evening air to brush lightly across her face. She felt the city's pulse, slowed, softened, yet steady. Montmartre had changed, but its essence lingered in the stones, in the echoes of laughter rising from late-night cafes, in the quiet determination of artists still working behind dimly lit windows. She no longer belonged to its boisterous heart. She belonged instead to its quiet periphery, a place of reflection rather than revelry. And she found, to her surprise, that this suited her well. As she sat in her chair, wrapped in the fading golden light, she sensed her life folding into a gentle curve, a soft arc leading toward conclusion, but not yet complete. She did not fear the end. She feared only leaving things unfinished. The letter she had begun for Maurice, the sketch lying half-drawn on her table, the canvas she had intended to revisit with fresh eyes. But even these worries were mild, softened by acceptance. She had given much to the world, pain, passion, beauty, truth, and the world had given much in return, though not always kindly. What remained now was not regret, but reflection. The twilight deepened, and the colors in the room shifted from gold to silver blue. Suzanne reached for her lamp and lit it slowly, watching the flame bloom into a small circle of warmth. She leaned back in her chair, the blanket gathered loosely around her, and allowed her eyes to close for a moment. Her breath rose and fell in a quiet rhythm, each inhale carrying the memory of creation, each exhale releasing another thread of the past. Outside, the night gathered itself, patient and gentle, waiting just beyond the window. The dusty frame leaned against the forgotten wall as though waiting for a hand that no longer came, its once polished surface dulled by years of quiet neglect. Suzanne's studio had grown still in those final days, the muted light filtering through the curtains with the delicate gentleness of someone afraid to intrude. She moved through the room more slowly now, her steps measured, her breathing shallower than before. The twilight years had shifted into something softer, more fragile, yet not without a certain quiet dignity. She sensed her strength ebbing, not in abrupt descent, but in a gradual loosening, as though the threads binding her to the world were untangling themselves with a patient tenderness. And though she felt the nearness of an ending, she did not greet it with fear, only with contemplation. It was during these days when exhaustion draped itself around her like a shawl worn thin from use that Suzanne found herself returning again and again to the dusty frame. It held a painting from decades earlier, a portrait abandoned during a time when life had demanded of her more than she had to give. She had turned it to face the wall long ago, intending to revisit it once she felt ready, yet the years had swept by and the painting remained untouched. Now, in her final season, she approached it with the cautious reverence one gives to an old confession. Her hands trembled slightly as she lifted it, the dust rising in tiny clouds, the weight of the frame heavier than she remembered. She hesitated before turning it around, as though uncertain whether she wished to confront the face captured beneath the varnish. When she finally did, the sight of it stole her breath. Not because of the skill or lack of it, but because of the woman she had been when she painted it. The portrait revealed a younger Suzanne, eyes lit with a blend of fierce determination and vulnerability. Her expression caught between defiance and yearning. The sight pierced her, a reminder of the battles she had fought, the rebellions she had embraced, the sacrifices she had endured. She reached out tentatively, fingertips brushing the dry surface, feeling an echo of the person she once was. It seemed to her then that the portrait was not simply a painting, but a record of her own becoming. It captured a moment when she stood at the edge of her life, both hardened and hopeful, unbroken yet far from unscarred. Looking at it now, she felt a mingling of sorrow and tenderness, sorrow for the struggles that young woman would endure, tenderness for the courage she had carried into each uncertain step. As the days grew quieter, memory intertwined with waking life. She spent hours seated near her window, watching the muted world pass by beneath her. Children walked to school, shopkeepers opened their doors, the distant toll of church bells floated on the air. Each sound felt softened, as though wrapped in a veil. She recognized fewer faces now, though a few old neighbors still paused to greet her when she ventured outside. Montmartre continued its bustling rhythm, but Suzanne felt herself drifting at its margins, no longer at the center of its creative pulse, but a quiet observer of the world she had once inhabited so fiercely. Her final illness did not arrive suddenly. It seeped into her gradually, like a slow tide rising at night. There were mornings when her limbs felt impossibly heavy, afternoons when breathing required more effort than she cared to admit. She grew more tired with each passing day, yet she continued to paint as long as her hands allowed it. The canvases she completed in these last months carried a softness unlike any she had created before. The colors were muted, the forms gentle, the composition simple yet deeply contemplative. It was as if she were painting the quiet between breaths, the space where memory and presence overlapped. These works were not meant for exhibition. They were offerings to herself, to her life, to the quiet truths she had discovered only in her fading strength. Maurice visited often during this time, sometimes daily. He arrived with flowers, with fruit, with small gifts she had no need for but accepted with a smile. Their relationship had softened in these last years, the sharp edges worn down by time and understanding. He sat with her in the afternoons, reading aloud from newspaper pages or recounting stories from his own work. At times, she sensed his fear in the way he lingered near her chair, his silence betraying the worry he carried. She reached for his hand on those days, holding his fingers in her own fragile ones, silently reassuring him that she felt no fear. She did not know whether he believed her, but she hoped he did. On the morning of her passing, the world was unusually quiet. The sky hung low with soft gray clouds, and the air carried the stillness that often precedes rain. Suzanne lay in her bed, her breath shallow but steady, her eyes half open as though hovering between sleep and waking. She thought of the countless faces she had known, the streets she had walked, the paintings she had created in defiance of a world that doubted her. She thought of the laughter that once filled her studio, the quarrels that shook her to her core, the nights spent painting until dawn when she felt the fire of youth burning in her chest. She thought of Maurice, of the life they had built together from scraps and stubbornness, of the love that endured despite everything that threatened it. In her final minutes, she felt no fear, only a profound weariness and a gentle unraveling, as though the weight she had carried all her life were slowly lifting from her shoulders. Her eyes drifted toward the dusty frame she had leaned once more against the wall, its image now fully visible. The younger version of herself gazed back with unbroken intensity, and Suzanne felt a quiet smile form on her lips. It was as though she were offering that younger woman a final reassurance, a soft acknowledgement of all they had survived together. Then, with a slow exhale that seemed to empty her of every sorrow she had ever held, she closed her eyes. The world outside carried on with its ordinary rhythms. A neighbor shut a window. A carriage rattled down the street. A child laughed in the distance. Within the studio, the air lay still around the fragile figure on the bed, around the canvases that bore her life in color and form, around the frame leaning against the wall like a silent witness. And so, without fanfare, Suzanne Valadon left the world she had defied, quietly, as though stepping into the soft folds of a forgotten dream. The soft echo of someone unwrapping an old painting lingered in the room like a breath held too long, trembling at the edge of release, It was not Suzanne's studio now. Her quiet sanctuary had long since fallen empty, but another space, years after her passing, where her canvases lay waiting in silence. Time had settled gently over them, leaving a powdery haze of dust on their frames, as though offering a shroud of forgetfulness. Her name, once murmured with both admiration and suspicion among the cafes of Montmartre, had faded into the muted corners of memory, overshadowed by the towering reputations of the men she had worked beside. And yet, her art endured quietly, patient as stone, waiting for the world to turn its gaze back to what it had overlooked. Her legacy was not loud nor immediate. It arrived in whispers, in rediscovered works, in scholars' hesitant intrigue as they leaned closer to her daring lines and unflinching honesty. In the years following her death, Suzanne Valadon's presence seemed to drift like an echo that almost vanished. The art world, consumed with shifting movements and new vanguards, did not pause to recall the life of the rebellious painter who had carved her truth onto canvas with such fierce devotion. Museums stored her pieces in the dim recesses of their archives, and collectors spoke of her only in passing, tucked between discussions of Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Degas. Some remembered her merely as a muse, a model whose striking features had graced the works of men now immortalized in galleries across Europe. Others, unaware or uninterested in her own artistic achievements, referred to her through the lens of scandal. The affairs, the defiance, the rumors that had once colored her reputation. It seemed for a time as though her life would dissolve into the margins of history, recorded only in footnotes, overshadowed by louder narratives. But history, like art, has its own peculiar rhythm. It loops, reverses, awakens, re-evaluates. And in this slow turning, something began to shift. A new generation of scholars, artists, and curators found themselves drawn to the works tucked away in quiet storage rooms, to the pieces that bore her distinctive voice, bold, unapologetic, raw with truth. They studied the thick strokes of her brush, the vibrant tension in her colors, the unidealized humanity in her figures. They sensed in her work a spirit ahead of its time, a woman whose determination had carved pathways into artistic territory long before the world was ready to acknowledge her. Exhibitions began to include her name alongside those once thought to define her. Books mentioned her not as an accessory to the men who painted her, but as an artist in her own right. And gradually, the echo of her presence began to strengthen, reverberating across decades, reaching new eyes with each rediscovery. Yet her legacy would never be simple. Some continued to misunderstand her, flattening her into the narrative of a troubled muse who stumbled into painting by proximity rather than by talent. Others romanticized her struggles, painting her life as a dramatic tale rather than the nuanced, resilient journey it had truly been. Few understood the quiet endurance that shaped her, the strength required to survive the dual burdens of poverty and ambition, the fierce clarity she carried even when the world dismissed her for daring to exist beyond its expectations. The truth of her legacy lay not in the myths spun around her, but in the subtle power of her work. The way her paintings refused to soften the reality of women's lives, the way her figures stood solid and grounded, their presence a silent protest against invisibility. In many ways, history remembered her incorrectly. It celebrated the men who had painted her, but not the woman who had painted herself into existence. It admired the canvases that immortalized her youth, but ignored the ones she created with her own hands, shaped by years of observation and an unyielding will. Even now, many viewers stand before her works without fully grasping the courage threaded through them, the courage it took to claim space in a world that insisted she remain a decorative object rather than a creator. They see the finished pieces, but not the long nights of labor, the trembling moments of doubt, the determination that hardened in her like iron as she faced each dismissal with a stronger, clearer voice. And yet, there is a quiet grace in this imperfect remembrance. For though the world did not celebrate her loudly, her art has begun to whisper again, softly, steadily, insistently. Each time someone discovers one of her paintings in a gallery, each time a scholar traces the boldness of her strokes, each time a young artist finds in her life a reflection of their own struggle, her presence grows a little stronger. Her legacy lives in the eyes that linger on her canvases, in the hearts that recognize themselves in her defiant honesty. The world may misremember her in some ways, but it also continues to rediscover her, slowly restoring the fragments of her story that time had scattered. What remains most striking as her legacy unfolds is the realization that Suzanne did not paint for remembrance. She painted because she had to, because her life demanded expression, because the world inside her was too rich, too turbulent, too raw to remain unspoken. Her legacy, then, is not merely the collection of works she left behind, but the unbreakable thread of truth she wove through them, a truth that defied convention, challenged assumptions, and insisted on being seen even when others turned away. In the end, her legacy is the quiet testament of a woman who refused to disappear, whose presence lingers in strokes of color that refuse to fade, in the unwrapped painting that reveals a story far deeper than the frame that holds it. She remains, in her own way, both forgotten and unforgettable. And somewhere, perhaps in a gallery corner or a private collection, another hand pulls gently at the paper surrounding one of her hidden works, the faint sound of unwrapping echoing softly into the room, carrying her name into the air once more. The shadow stretched across Montmartre in the fading afternoon light, long and thin and wavering, as though uncertain whether to anchor itself to the cobblestones or drift free into the dusk. It might have belonged to any passerby at first glance, but there was something in its outline, its quiet defiance, its calm persistence, that evoked a memory older than the street itself. Suzanne's presence lingered there, not as a ghost nor as a legend, but as an impression etched into the very slope of the hill she had climbed so many times. People walked past without noticing, as the world often does with the traces left behind by lives it once overlooked. Yet if one paused long enough, if one let the silence settle and the mind drift gently toward the past, the shadow felt unmistakable, like the soft imprint of a footstep preserved after the walker has long since disappeared. Legacy is a peculiar thing. It does not unfold with precision nor remain intact through the passage of time. It bends, reshapes, gathers layers of interpretation, and loses others. Suzanne Valadon's legacy is no exception. For all her determination, her brilliance, and the undeniable force of her work, history remembers her in uneven strokes, some bold, some faded, some entirely missing. As the decades rolled forward, those who spoke her name often did so through the narrow lens of her origins. The unruly muse, the rebellious model, the woman whose image appeared beneath the confident signatures of Renoir, Toulouse-Lautrec, and others whose reputations eclipsed her own. Her early roles became the scaffolding upon which later interpretations rested, reducing her to a footnote in the narratives of men whose fame rose swiftly and securely. Yet this, perhaps, is where her story is most often misunderstood. People imagine her as a woman carried along by the currents of bohemian Paris, as though her entry into art was accidental, as though her audacity were merely temperament rather than survival. They speak of her affairs as though they were the defining arcs of her life, rather than mere fragments in a much larger mosaic. They forget that the same world that now champions her often dismissed her with casual certainty while she was alive. They forget the instability, the hunger, the moments when she stood on the brink of collapse yet chose, again and again, to push herself forward with a stubbornness that refused surrender. Even now, the myth of the Muse clings stubbornly to her, overshadowing the painter she fought to become. In some retellings, she is frozen eternally in Renoir's glowing palette, forever young, forever soft, forever the object of someone else's vision. But the real Suzanne was never soft in the way the world expected. She was a woman forged in the fire of hardship, a woman whose brush refused to idealize what she saw. Her figures were not languid fantasies, but grounded bodies, weighted with truth. Her colors were fierce, her lines unapologetic. She drew not from illusion, but from life, raw, unvarnished, and unafraid. If history misremembers her, it is not merely through omission, but through the subtle diminishing of her agency. The story told most often is the story that flatters the familiar names of the male avant-garde, how she sat for them, how they admired her, how they shaped her world. Rarely does the narrative linger on how she reshaped their understanding in return. Rarely does it explore how her presence challenged their preconceptions, how her perspective, sharp, grounded, brimming with its own authority, nudged against their assumptions. Men painted her body, yes, but they could not contain her vision. Even while she posed, she was learning, absorbing, questioning, crafting her future with each stroke they believed she did not understand. Her work, too, has suffered from selective remembrance. The paintings that survive are often viewed as curiosities, anomalies created by a woman in a field dominated by men. Yet those who take the time to truly see them recognize something deeper. They see the quiet revolution embedded in her compositions, the dignity she granted to ordinary domestic moments, the emotional weight she infused into bodies that lived and aged and suffered rather than adorn themselves for the viewer's comfort. They see the defiance in her brush, the refusal to soften or embellish. Hers was not the art of seduction, but of revelation. Still, it is easier for the world to celebrate her as an exception rather than confront what her story demands. A rebalancing of the narrative, a recognition that brilliance can emerge from the margins, from unlikely places, from people whom society has trained itself not to notice. Her legacy insists that talent is not bestowed by circumstance, that genius can germinate in poverty, that persistence can eclipse privilege. Her life challenges the comfortable myth that success is shaped by merit alone. It reminds us of the invisible labor, the unacknowledged suffering, the countless obstacles overcome by those who refuse to remain unseen. And so her legacy remains both incomplete and compelling, inaccurately remembered, yet impossible to forget, fragmented, yet quietly indelible. She slips between the lines of history like a figure painted in bold strokes but described in soft whispers. Her name does not thunder through the halls of the world's great museums, yet her presence lingers in the corners, waiting for the patient observer. She is neither fully absent nor fully present, residing instead in that delicate intermediate space, much like the shadow stretching across Montmartre at dusk. If one stands at the crest of the hill where she once walked in her youth, where she once followed a wind-tossed sketch toward her uncertain future, one might feel it still. The echo of her laughter, the weight of her determination, the quiet ache of her resilience. The streets hold faint memory of her footsteps. The cafes carry the residue of her presence. The studios whisper remnants of her lessons. She remains woven into the fabric of the place, not through monuments or plaques, but through the subtle imprint of a life lived with unflinching honesty. And perhaps that is how she would have wanted it. Not a legacy carved in stone or gilded in praise, but a living, breathing memory carried gently by those who choose to look closely. A presence felt more than proclaimed, a truth that requires contemplation rather than acclaim. As the sun dipped lower, the shadow lengthened one final time across the slope of Montmartre, stretching toward a horizon tinged with violet and gold. It wavered briefly, then softened, then dissolved into the gathering dusk. Yet somehow, even in its fading, it left behind a sense of persistence, a quiet refusal to disappear entirely. For the life of Suzanne Valadon, with all its fractures and triumphs, remains in those who remember, in those who rediscover, and in those who dare to look beyond the myth to find the woman who refused to remain anyone's muse.